Looking back at the past, it all makes sense now. Fate had no hand in our meeting. I was taught that fate doesn't exist, but the moment we as humans accept accidents as inevitable, then it becomes fate. If my teacher taught me right, then fate never existed for us. My name is Annette Rozenberg, and this is my story. The skies were painted in different shades of purple by the fading sun, and its rays stained the arched windows of the hallways as I walked through, casting long shadows in my path. I let myself into his study, an envelope in my hand. I called out to him and asked if he wouldn't like to read the letter I had with me. I slapped it down on the table. It was a confidential letter addressed to me. But my husband, Heiner, casually shrugged, said he was busy and we'd talk later. He returned to his work, scribbling away on a parchment paper without regarding me any further. That didn't faze me. I had a couple of things on my mind to say to him. I dropped the bombshell. I'd gone through the trouble of digging up his past. That seemed to catch his attention. And he stopped writing to look up at me. I'd always wondered why he treated me the way he did, why he'd changed all of a sudden. Even if he'd fallen out of love, he was taking it way too far. He sighed my name aloud, eager to put an end to the conversation. But I told him that I'd figured it all out. I asked him if he'd always had an agenda for me right from the beginning. And my bluntness stunned him into admitting the truth. He had. I let out a sad laugh, empty of amusement and bitter with hurt. I reasoned aloud that it must have felt hard to love the daughter of his enemy. Looking back in time, the meeting I'd attributed to fate had been under his control the whole time. I'd been so in love on our wedding day, so happy to be Heiner's bride. But he'd played me from the very beginning. You see, the kingdom of Pedania was ruled by a tyrant monarchy. My father, Marquess Dietrich Rosenberg, was the king's nephew, and we were a part of the royal family. My father had been the general of the Pedania army, and Heiner was his favorite commander. I'd been at the ceremony of his knighting, and I saw the pride in my father's eyes when he looked at Commander Heiner Waldemar. One day in late spring, when the roses were at their most spectacular full bloom, there was a meeting in the Rosenberg mansion. I bumped into Heiner. At least I thought I had. What followed was 2 years of courtship that ended in marriage. But my happily ever after didn't last at all. In fact, it came to an end sooner than I could have imagined. The people rebelled against the royal family, and many nobles were killed, including my father. My mother, devastated by the news, took her own life. And at the center of the rebellion, as the flag bearer and commander-in-chief, was Heiner Waldemar. But I was still blinded by my foolishness. I still trusted him, even though he was responsible for the death of my family and everyone else that mattered to me. Then without warning, he changed. No, he just showed his true colors. He treated me with dispassion, like the enemy. Even yet, I was still disillusioned and assumed that our meeting on that rose field was the work of fate. Even with my family gone, the people wanted more. They wanted me dead. What had I ever done to them? I'd tried to understand my husband, make excuses for him. He'd had no other choice since the times were changing. The hunger for my head increased by the day. But I remained trusting Heiner's love. The hatred and taunting intensified. In the eyes of the people, I would always be the villain. The daughter of the military officer who oppressed the civilians. I was called a superficial woman who enjoyed living off the blood of others. Such cruel accusations. I took all of it, even though I'd been so clueless about the politics that my family had played behind the scenes. I lived in limbo, merely existing, so alone. But I'd waited for Heiner in the hope that he'd stand by me. Where did I go wrong? Did I commit a crime by simply being alive? I finally found my answer. The why. It was all in the letter. I remember trying to change his mind. How foolish I was. It was pointless because he'd never changed in the first place. He just never loved me from the start. I looked at him square in the eyes and asked him to prove me wrong. With only a moment's hesitation, he finally answered no. I felt my heart twitch with hurt inside my chest. I demanded the truth from him. I deserved to hear it all from his mouth after all, didn't I? Heiner was silent for a while before his lips slowly curled up in a smirk. Then he let it all out. The truth. He'd loathed my father and the monarchy. That was the truth. Approaching me had just been part of the plan. He said all of this with a nonchalance that stunned me to silence. And then, with a heavy heart, I asked him if I was also an object of his loathing. I wonder what I'd expected to hear because nothing would have prepared me for the words that came out of his mouth next. He told me then about how 2 years ago there'd been a big fuss over reports that the monarchs were raising spies. He clenched his fist as he continued. Heiner confessed to being a spy at the training camp overlooked by my father. The spies were groomed to be killed during missions or eliminated to keep dark secrets. Only Heiner had survived because he'd made himself invaluable to the kingdom with his services. After my father strengthened his reputation as General of Pedania, he was content to keep Heiner by his side, and that was how we met. Silly me. And there I'd been, sympathizing with him for losing his comrades in battle. Heiner continued. He admitted that seeing me in my innocence, dressed nicely, and speaking of condolence like it was a priceless gift, made him realize that something was wrong. Was I included as an object of loathing? He dropped the answer. He despised me. I felt my chest constrict even more with hurt and betrayal as I let out a little gasp. My questions were answered. He'd approached me to take his revenge. Heiner Waldemar, he despised me from the very beginning, through the fake smiles and all. I finally admitted that learning the truth made things easier. Without knowing all of this, I'd loved him. But I was done. I told him that I wanted a divorce, and he plainly told me that he couldn't grant me that. I was shocked. I asked him why. What use did he have for me? My parents were dead and the monarchy was out of his way for good, and I was left with nothing. All that I had left I had because I was Waldemar's wife. He'd won. Couldn't he see that? What more could he possibly want from me? But Heiner slammed his hand on the table as he rose to his feet. He walked around the table until he was towering over me, his eyes dimmed with hatred. He called my name and grabbed my face roughly. Then he asked how I could dream of being happy elsewhere. In my defiance, I told him there was nowhere I could find happiness again. But this only pleased him. He leaned in closer and said that it made things easier. If that was the case, then I was going to remain forever unhappy by his side. What kind of sick psycho could say such a thing? Seeing him enveloped in scarlet opened my eyes to see clearly. His revenge had only begun. The line between memories and dreams blurred in my mind. When I shut my eyes, I couldn't tell which was which. Was this now a dream or a memory? We sat out in the rose fields under the clear skies. I gushed over how Heiner was so incredible at everything. I asked him how many languages he spoke, and he answered 4. I was so awed by his answer and admitted I was not as exceptional as he was. I was too scared to leave Pedania and had no real talent for studying at all. But Heiner, kind as always, quickly pointed out how I could play the piano. I blushed in modesty and confessed my doubts about my future to him. Heiner quickly reassured me, his eyes warm with kindness. He was so certain I'd become a great pianist. I blushed again. It seemed to be the only thing I could do around him. I asked if he'd heard me play before, and he brushed it off by saying I looked like a natural. How did he always know to say the right thing at the right time? I laughed to hide my blush and complimented his sense of humor. Moments later, we were out on the open sea, drifting slowly in a boat under the light of the moon. Heiner took my hands in his and asked the question that changed my life forever. He asked me to marry him. The diamond ring glinted under the light of the moon. I sang his name in a mixture of joy and surprise, admiring the ring on my finger. It was perfect. Heiner promised to make me happy forever. I flew into his arms, swept away by the fantasy of a forever with the man I loved. Suddenly, the words forever and happy rang out repeatedly. The sound was as ominous as the darkness around us, building in suspense until it climaxed into Heiner's malicious promise to keep me unhappy by his side forever. I flinched in horror, my eyes darting wide open. Suddenly, the realization hit me. As I gripped the bedsheets tightly across my chest, my hands trembling, I admitted the truth to myself. I'd only been dreaming. How much of Heiner had seeped deep into the fabrics of my soul? By morning, I picked up a newspaper and the headline came flying at me like an assault. The people wanted the remnants of the Pedania monarchy gone. They saw no use in preserving it, in preserving me. I felt my head ache with dizziness and realized I needed air. I walked quietly through the hallway, my steps echoing against the walls. I was too lost in my thoughts to notice I wasn't alone until he called out. Major Eugene Markov, Heiner's most devout subordinate. He flashed a false smile on his face as he greeted and hoped that all was well with me. But I could read beneath the surface and hear the sarcasm in his words. He'd be pleased if all wasn't well. I kept my gaze on the floor as I answered and said nothing had changed and quickly excused myself to leave. I'd hardly taken a step forward when Major Markov dropped a bombshell. Heiner had received a marriage proposal. I paused, rooted to the spot by his words. I could hear the malicious satisfaction in his voice as he spoke. He asked if I knew Annalie. Apparently, she'd been by Heiner's side during the rebellion and earned the people's support for her role in the victory. I listened to him in shock, and even though I had my back turned to him, I could hear the smile in his voice as he asked if I thought they'd be a good couple. I smiled sadly and answered in the affirmative. Then Markov turned around to face me, his voice full of irritation as he spoke. He said the media was going to spread the news and asked how long I was going to remain carefree. Was he really saying something new? Like I had no idea what was happening around me? The people wanted my demise. The newspapers wanted every trace of the monarchy wiped out, including me. I was threatened and abused in letters I received every day. Being Heiner's wife brought me nothing but pain. Markov slapped his forehead in exasperation and said I was Heiner's only flaw. He asked if I had any idea why people thought about my marriage. I quickly told him that I'd asked Heiner for a divorce. Markov looked at me in surprise and disbelief. I plainly told him that Heiner wouldn't accept my request because he wanted to watch me suffer. I'd only learned that fact a little too late. I looked up at Markov and asked him to help persuade Heiner to let me go since we both clearly wanted the same thing for once. I knew the truth. Everyone loathed me. I was the enemy. The realization made my heart burn with grief. Why had I ever assumed that Heiner was any different than them? That he loved me where they hated me and my family? I felt stupid. While in my bedroom later in the day, I heard a knock on the door but remained silent. I heard the door open and someone stepped in. Heiner, I knew at once. He called out to me and sat on the bedside. He casually said he knew I was awake and asked me to listen to what he had to say. He said he was going to decline Annalie's proposal quietly before the news broke out. Heiner told her I wasn't going to accept the proposal and asked me to forget about ever leaving. If he claimed to hate me, why did he even want to keep me from leaving? He couldn't even say the word divorce aloud. I finally spoke. I told him that people thought I was living an expensive life on his account and wondered why we were still married. I told him how they called me a flaw that had to be wiped out of his life. I wondered to myself if this was just about watching me wither away by his side, if there was something more. I asked him if he hated me that much to take such risks. Then he admitted, calling my name softly before continuing and saying that he didn't know what guarantee I had to live a better life outside the palace. I laughed bitterly and asked if he thought I had an inheritance hidden away somewhere. He knew I had nothing or anywhere to go. But he wasn't taking any chances. My father had too many connections who had the resources to help me. I quickly interjected and told him I didn't need anyone's help. All I wanted was the divorce. Simple. Heiner's eyes dimmed into slits in anger as he glared at me. He said that since I wanted the divorce so badly, it made him all the more willing to keep me for as long as he could. As I stared into those eyes that had once looked down at me with so much love, I couldn't help but wonder when exactly they became filled with such darkness. Why didn't I notice it? Why couldn't I read through his smiles and loving voice? Why had I fallen so deeply in love with a man who was a living lie? I had to admit, he was really an excellent spy. I angrily retorted and said to him that I didn't want to live with him anymore. But he didn't seem to understand the concept. Why did I resent him for betraying my family? But my response stunned him. I didn't resent him. I told him I just couldn't resent anyone, even if the whole world was against me. Because I didn't deserve to. I told Heiner about the newspapers and how every column seemed to be clamoring for my death sentence. I shocked him more by saying that I had no problem getting killed if it was the people's desire. I hadn't changed one bit when it came to politics. I was still so naive, but one thing I'd come to learn was the truth behind rights and democracy. I now understood why the people wanted nothing to do with the monarchy. I still didn't understand it fully, but I'd come to accept it. Because everyone still blamed me? I asked Heiner if he was okay with my terms, dying if it pleased the people. He quickly lashed out and asked if I knew the implications of my words. I told him I didn't care, as long as I got my divorce. Even if it meant dying, I didn't want to meet my end as his wife. I didn't want to show this side of me to the man I once loved. I wanted to keep what was left of my pride. Heiner clenched his fist in rage. He said the word divorce thrice, spitting it with disgust as he reached for and grabbed me by my shoulders. He looked at me in the eyes and said, "The reason I could demand a divorce was because I had an easy life." Then he declared it like a death sentence. I'd always be his wife. He didn't stop there. He declared that all he wanted was for me to be unable to dream of freedom or happiness. He wished for me to endure the burden of unhappiness and pay for my mistakes right before him. Heiner let me go and rose to leave. He spoke to me over his shoulders without sparing me another glance. There was going to be a hotel opening banquet in a couple of days, and he wanted me to attend with him. I knew I didn't have a choice, but I dared to ask anyway. I asked if he'd take me by force if I refused to go with him. Heiner delivered the next round of words like a blow to my guts. If I continued defying him, he'd lock me up forever in a psychiatric ward. I looked at him in stunned silence. Heiner wasn't done speaking. He carried on, saying that there was no point in running away since he was always going to find me, because he had the power to do so. If I didn't want that to happen, I'd be better off following his instructions. I realized at that moment, Heiner had always been like this. I knew he'd approached me with an agenda, but I'd fooled myself into a delusional fantasy. I'd denied the truth and deceived myself. Even when his attitude towards me first changed, I'd concluded that he'd fallen out of love with me because I'd temporarily lost everything I had. I kept on telling myself he'd come back soon and we'd go back to our fairy tale love. Heiner hissed my name, cutting through my thoughts as he demanded an answer. I flinched in fright. But why didn't I realize the truth sooner? Love derived from benefits was nowhere near genuine. I finally conceded to Heiner's demands. I'd go to his hotel's opening banquet. I'd been foolish. He banged the door noisily on his way out of the room. I was left to battle the demons that had come to plague my life in recent times. Thanks to Heiner, I suffered from insomnia. I let out a sigh and began searching my drawers for the pills that could save me from my dilemma. I found them and popped them down my throat in a heartbeat. But they didn't feel enough. I picked up a small container holding more pills and toyed with the idea of popping them all down my throat at once. But I couldn't bring myself to do that. I let out a sigh of defeat. I went to my doctor, Dr. Burkle, by morning of the following day to tell him that the pills weren't working. I asked him for a new prescription, preferably something stronger, and told him how I'd woken up with a headache. Dr. Burkle shook his head and said I was searching for a drug capable of the impossible. Headaches were nothing to be alarmed about. But I didn't agree with him and asked if he really thought the headaches were normal. He gave me a hard glance before maintaining his position. They were. I nodded in defeat. But I had other symptoms as well. A constant feeling of nauseousness and fevers. I told the doctor this and complained that I just didn't feel well. But Dr. Burke wasn't convinced. He dismissed it as stress from a lack of exercise and advised me to walk around the palace a bit to stay fit. As far as he was concerned, I had a habit of exaggerating minor inconveniences. He was the royal physician and not my personal doctor after all. He flopped down 2 more packs of the sleeping pills on the desk. I could hear a maid giggle in the corner. I swallowed the embarrassment and thanked the doctor for his time. The days rolled by quickly, and the day for the hotel opening banquet came. Heiner held me perched on his arm, his lips curled up in a wicked smirk while my face was the total opposite. Mr. Schmidt, the owner of the hotel, quickly came around to welcome Heiner. Not sure he meant to welcome me as well. Mr. Schmidt thanked Heiner for his investment and asked about Franz, reasoning that whatever was happening there would affect the new branch he'd just established. Heiner confidently assured him that they'd keep Franz in check with help from Vitarus. I remained silent, mentally absent from the banquet even though I was physically present. Then came more people, with more greetings. And then we were ushered away to a huge reception area. But why had I ever assumed Heiner was a difficult man to read? Even though I was unwanted by virtually everyone at the banquet, Heiner still roped me in, to fulfill the bare minimum as his wife. It was all clear to me now. He probably wanted to punish me for rarely leaving the residence. After all, the banquet was filled with people with different vendetta against me. I drank a glass of wine and pretended not to listen, but I couldn't help eavesdropping on Heiner's conversation with the hotel owner. Schmidt asked about his marriage proposal to Lady Annalie, and Heiner told him that he'd declined it. Mr. Schmidt quickly expressed his surprise and added that everyone thought Heiner and Annalie would make a good couple. Heiner glanced in my direction as he answered and told them that he'd been right to decline a proposal he'd had no need for in the first place, because he was already married. His eyes were squinted in a frown as he spoke. I set down the glass in my hand and wondered how callous people could be to gossip about me like I wasn't just a few steps away from them. Did they think that less of me? How cruel! I'd picked up another glass of wine and lifted it to my lips when I felt a strong squeeze on my shoulder. I let out his name in a gasp of shock. Heiner? What did he want from me this time? The lights came on and the MC's voice came alive through the speakers. He asked if everyone was enjoying the evening, and in appreciation for our attendance, we'd be having a very special guest. The pride of Pedania. The guest was none other than the great maestro himself, pianist Felix Kafka. My eyes widened in awe and admiration as a small gasp escaped from my lips. Felix was popular for winning nearly all competitions all over the world. The other guests were electric with excitement, clapping and cheering as Felix stepped up to the piano. He was indeed the pride of Pedania. I watched on in disbelief. I couldn't believe I was listening to the legendary pianist again in my lifetime. Felix began playing, the notes sailing smoothly through the air. He was playing a familiar Peace Nocturne No. 2. It might have been 3 years since the last time I played the keyboard, but I could never forget that sweet melody. I held my hands against my chest as the waves of nostalgia hit. Felix gave life to the piece as he played. Felix Kafka had always been my role model. From the very first day I touched a piano, Felix's performances always inspired me to pursue my dream. At the end of his performance, the guests went wild with applause and cheers. Oh, Felix. I'd always wanted to be like him. I'd met Felix a couple of times in the past, courtesy of my father's connections. I'd even gotten his autograph, received his encouragement, and even spoken to him. I had a conversation with the legendary Felix Kafka himself. But everything has changed now. Felix had come from nothing, defied the odds, and made a name for himself. I felt a strange question tug at the back of my mind. Had Felix secretly despised me right from the beginning? Perhaps because of my privileged background? I settled into a sad silence until it finally struck me. Heiner's voice cut through my thoughts as he whispered my name gently. I opened my eyes and realized nearly everyone in the room was looking in my direction. Someone asked if I played the piano. I flinched in shock, completely unprepared. Another asked if I was going to play a song on the piano. I answered with a panicked stutter, hardly making any coherent statements. The murmurs kept flying about. One reminded me that I'd come in third in an international competition. Another asked if I didn't hold a recital. A strange lady approached me and began prodding me in the direction of the piano. I protested and said I hadn't played in a long time. I didn't trust my abilities on the piano anymore. But the lady was having none of it. She just assumed I was being humble and added that she'd heard I'd learned from a very long age. I maintained my protests, stealing a glance behind me to see Heiner's reaction, making a silent plea for him to at least intervene. But his eyes were expressionless, and he did nothing to help me. The lady continued prodding me forward until she'd sat me down on the piano stool. I'd been foolish to assume Heiner would come to my rescue. I saw Felix watching from the crowd, his eyes full of sadness for me. Then I wondered to myself, will this monumental embarrassment satisfy everyone? Would it please them to see someone from a powerful family made into a laughingstock? I feared I wouldn't meet the expectations of the people who wanted to hear me play. My hands trembled as I held them over the keys of the piano. My mind kept rolling back in time, to the night that changed everything, the last time I'd ever played. My father had come into my room that night and asked me to run. There was no time to explain, but the urgency was evident in his voice. He asked me to turn around and use the back door. How would I have ever guessed that'd be the last thing I'd hear my father say to me? He was shot, murdered in cold blood right before my eyes. In my shock, I could hear my father's murderers argue back and forth among themselves. They'd been instructed not to kill anyone in the house, but the deed had been done already. While I was still rooted to the spot in shock, the door swung open with a loud thud, and in came one of them, pointing a long rifle at me. He had a hint of mischief in his voice as he confirmed my identity, and he laughed mockingly at me when he realized I'd been playing the piano only moments ago. His cohorts joined him, their voices dragging along like a nightmare. Meanwhile, much later, Heiner sat in his study, mulling over the events of the banquet pensively. He peered through documents until he just couldn't hold back the rage anymore. What in the world had possessed Annette at the banquet? He let out a curse, crumpled the paper in his hands, and tossed it away. I had suddenly begun to act possessed, attacking the piano with a violence that seemed so violent and primal in every sense. Everyone was shocked, including Heiner. No one could understand what was happening or what was wrong with me. Gasps of shock rang through the air as I dealt blow after blow to the piano. Heiner closed the gap between us, startling me in the process. I sobbed and told him I wanted to go home. As Heiner sat in his study, thinking back on the incident, he couldn't help but draw one conclusion. It had all the signs of trauma. But he wasn't okay with making excuses for me just like that. He clenched his fist, scrunching up a document in the process. How could it have been trauma? He knew I hadn't cried in 3 whole years. He'd assumed that all my life, I'd lived in a safe mansion, throwing parties for fun. Heiner didn't buy the trauma story. Not at all. He angrily flung more papers off his desk. But he'd seen on the night of the banquet. I'd been so genuinely rattled by an ordinary piano. That couldn't have been fake, right? But I'd also been the one who'd come to ask for a divorce days before, and with such a straight face. Heiner vowed not to let me go in peace. Not after everything he'd been through just to have me. He didn't care how silly his choice might have seemed to other people. Heiner let out a loud sigh, grabbing his head in exasperation. I was a part of his past. One he was ashamed of. One he wished to erase. I walked into the room and hit the light switch. I pulled off the covers to reveal my first real love. My piano from the Rozenberg mansion. I stood before it. A wave of nostalgia hit me. I'd had it for as long as I could remember. I lifted up the lid and admired the familiar white and black keys my fingers had caressed for years. I knew what notes to play, but what was the point anyway? I couldn't bring myself to touch the keys, let alone play anything meaningful. It brought back the memory of my father's death. The day he died, my whole life was destroyed. Everyone was always quick to say I owed my success to my father's money, power, and connections. I'd thought that things would get better with time after he died, but now it was clear to me that I had nothing left. Meanwhile, Heiner learned from the house staff and Dr. Burkle that I wasn't eating, and I wouldn't leave the house too. He was livid. I was getting on his nerves. He marched straight off to my room and knocked hard on my door. When he let himself into the room, I wouldn't even look at him. He asked if I'd rather waste my day embroidering than eat my meals like everyone else. I didn't lift my eyes up from the piece I was working on as I asked if he was making a protest. I went on to apologize casually. Heiner's eyes trailed to the desk where he found packets of pills scattered on it. He marched over to the desk and peeked into the half-open drawer. I tried to stop him, but it was too late. He found a pill dish, different from the rest. He lifted it up and asked me to explain. I looked away as I said it was only medication, a half-lie. Heiner asked if the pills weren't prescribed by Dr. Burkle, but I simply told him they were the ones I didn't take. Heiner wasn't buying my lie, but he simply let out an exasperated sigh. He told me that he'd instructed the staff to bring my food and he was taking the pills away. I didn't hear him clearly, so I opened my mouth in protest, but swallowed my words back when I realized what he was doing. I maintained that I wasn't hungry, and Heiner asked if I wished to starve myself to death. I wasn't ready to change my mind. Then Heiner asked if I couldn't think of a better way to die. I was a Rozenberg princess after all. I felt a throb in my heart at his words. I bit down hard on my lips as we both fell into an awkward silence. There was a knock on the door, and in came a servant with the meal. Heiner asked them to leave the meal on the table and then turned to ask me to eat. I politely asked him to leave so I could eat when I wanted to. But Heiner was wise. He quickly argued that I'd send it back once he left, and he wasn't entirely wrong. I turned to him, my patience running thin as I demanded to know why it mattered to him whether I ate or not. Heiner was confused even though he didn't show it. He wondered why I was so sensitive. Perhaps the pills were making me act up. He finally spoke out and remarked that I was acting unlike myself. I tossed the embroidery to the side and let out a sigh before saying, with every bit of sarcasm in my voice, that he must have known a lot about me. How else would he have won me over in the first place? When I spoke again, my voice was more resolved. Things were more different now. I was no longer his lover, neither was I the Rozenberg princess. I was... nothing. Nothing. The word made my heart ache. Even though he didn't speak aloud, I could hear Heiner agree with me. After all, my status had been dragged down to the trash, and everyone I loved was gone. Was that what he really thought of me? Heiner wondered to himself. Just how I managed to stay beautiful and noble. How was I able to take him back to those old, miserable times? I couldn't have known what he thought about me, so I was stuck in the present. He threatened to use force if I refused to eat my food willingly. I was too tired to carry on fighting anyway. I picked up the spoon and began stirring the soup idly. Heiner's eyes scanned the space until they found the embroidery in the corner. It was nothing like the ones I'd made him in the past. I used to gift him handmade embroidery when we were still in love, pouring my heart into every detail. But now, my work looked like a child's plaything at best. While he was still lost in thought, I called out to him and informed him that I'd like to go away for a while to be by myself. Heiner didn't buy my idea. How could he tell that I wouldn't run off? I kept calm and admitted that I didn't think he'd accept my request anyway, but I just realized how I was always asking his permission for everything. I dropped my spoon down with a loud clatter. I'd barely put the food in my mouth the whole time. Heiner asked if he had to leave before I at least pretended to eat. He finally asked me to do as I pleased, but promised to ship me off to a psychiatric ward if I ever attempted to starve myself again. Afterwards, he left my room, banging the door behind him. I sunk back into my pool of despair and self-pity once he left. Heiner went into his study and picked up his telephone to call the resident doctor. Dr. Burkle was very eager to speak with him. He asked him about the pills he'd seen in my room earlier and described it to the doctor. Dr. Burkle explained that it was medication for my insomnia and asked if there was a problem. Heiner answered in the negative and placed the receiver down. He found everything ridiculous as he examined the pill dish for one last time. He flung the pill dish into the waste bin, wondering if I'd planned to kill myself with the pills. But he dismissed the thought of concluding that I didn't have the courage for the act. As far as he knew, I was only looking for a lifeline to fall back on if he insisted on refusing the divorce. Heiner was certain I had no idea what true misery was. It was deeper than trivial business such as gossip and the piano. I knew nothing about the tortures, the beatings, or hunger he'd had to suffer. sometime in the past. I'd once complimented Heiner's eyes. They were pretty. He said he'd never been told that in the past. I told him they were the prettiest, and he quickly asked if I thought the rest of him was ugly. I told him I had high standards and I'd never be with a partner who wasn't handsome. But Heiner, my sweet Heiner, told me that he would never have minded what I looked like. But he still thought I was the most beautiful person in the world. In Heiner's study, he frowned as he recalled the memory. He wished for me to know despair, for me to be unhappy. He wanted my life to be just as miserable as his had become. But even then, he vowed to be by my side when I crumbled. I sat by the water fountain, lost in my thoughts. I finally admitted to myself I was tired. I'd wondered what I could have done to fix my marriage. I'd considered giving Heiner children, and even though I didn't get a compassionate night like any wife would dream of, he didn't reject me. He never let me see his bare body, and we never held each other until the morning. He always left me in his cold and lifeless room. But I'd hoped Heiner would return to his former self. Why didn't he reject me? The sun felt warm against my skin. Was Heiner merely leading me on? I shut my eyes and suddenly didn't mind dying by the water fountain at that moment. My thoughts were interrupted as someone said hello in greeting. I looked up and my eyes lit up in recognition. Lady Annalie, who'd sent the marriage proposal to Heiner. She asked if I had a minute to talk, and I obliged. Major Markov stood in the distance, letting out a displeased sigh when our eyes met. She knew him too. Did they fight side by side in the coup? Markov eventually walked away, leaving me with Lady Annalie. She said she'd been looking forward to meeting me for a while. Of course, I didn't believe her. Annalie asked how life was at the residence. She'd heard I wasn't leaving the premises often enough. I simply told her I was trying to live a simple life. She smiled in agreement and added that she'd only seen me in the papers, so she was genuinely curious about me. Such hypocrisy. I cut her short at that point and told her I knew she'd not left her business to come and chat with me. I needed her to get down to the point already. A moment of tense silence passed between us before we spoke again. She'd heard what many others had heard. Heiner wasn't granting a divorce. Annalie finally took off the mask of pretense she'd been wearing and admitted she didn't really like me. Hating me would be more accurate. She despised me for my heritage as Marquis. She respected Heiner enough to know he deserved someone better than me by his side. Her marriage to him had to happen to keep the opposition in check. I calmly pointed out that she had to speak with Heiner rather than me. But Annalie quickly cut in with a stern warning. I turned to look at her, surprised by her bold affront. She quickly rephrased and said she wanted us to use both the media and government to make Heiner abandon our marriage. I let out a tired sigh. How petty could a person get for their selfish means? I told Annalie that I knew I'd become the subject of her publicity campaign, and admitted that it had offended me at first. She'd been accusing me of things I'd barely had a hand in. Even while I was speaking, she quickly cut in and said that I wasn't exactly innocent. I agreed with her, not because she was right, but because I'd grown tired of everything. Even though the stories had been exaggerated, it was all still my fault. I was the villain. 3 years had gone by anyway, and I didn't hate her anymore. I respected the cause, and I truly did. With that, I rose to my feet and took a few steps away from the bench we'd been sitting on. I maintained that the divorce was no longer my decision, but urged her not to worry too much. My marriage to Heiner was on its way to the end. Sometime later, in the residence, I looked through the old financial records. There'd been some generous donations to the Citizens Association. I was interrupted by a knock on the door. A maid stepped inside and said I had a guest, a gentleman who claimed to be an old acquaintance. I was confused. An acquaintance? The maid added that he said I'd know his name. Ansgar. My eyes lit up in recognition and disbelief as I echoed the name. He stepped in and called out to me. Ansgar Stetter was the second son of Count Stetter, a friend of the Rosenbergs. It's been a long time since we last met. We'd grown up together, and he'd even proposed to me. When I'd refused his proposal, he'd gone off to Viderus to study, and we'd lost contact ever since. Ansgar enveloped me in a warm embrace once he came up close, leaving me with no time to react. He took one look at me and said I'd grown thinner than he remembered. Ansgar's family had fallen during the rebellion, but he'd been lucky to avoid danger since he was abroad. I pretended to be surprised that he found me thin, but he quickly intervened by saying I still looked beautiful. But the Pedanian citizens didn't hide their hatred for the aristocracy, and the people had branded me the villain already. As I led him to a lounging area, Ansgar said he'd sent me a letter, but I didn't respond, and that was why he'd come all the way to see me. I asked him if he'd sent the letter to my old address. I wondered what he'd need from me because I couldn't help him. Ansgar said he didn't. He sent it to me, as the wife of the commander-in-chief. He knew I'd never received any letters. I promised him I'd ask about it. I quickly switched the subject and asked after his well-being while we settled down for some tea. Was he back in Padania for good? Ansgar said he was only in the city to tie up some loose ends and pay me a visit. He was now the ambassador in France, the enemy territory in Heiner's and his subjects' books, that is. Ansgar said he'd fled to France after his graduation, like most other people did after the rebellion. I congratulated him on his appointment as an ambassador. But he waved it off modestly and said things might have been better if he'd never left. I wondered what he'd meant to imply by that statement. Ansgar said he was married and got divorced only the previous year. I gasped in surprise. He admitted he'd only married the lady for citizenship. He set down his teacup and said he had something to ask me. He'd heard about how the people had turned me into an object of hate for their publicity, and my husband had done nothing to help the situation. He finally asked the question of the century. Was I going to stay in my marriage? I was caught off guard by the directness of his question and glanced in the direction of the maid before answering. I told Ansgar I wanted to stay in the marriage only temporarily. I wanted a divorce too, but I had to wait until the time was right. Ansgar quickly asked if it was because I had nowhere to go if I got divorced. I sighed in frustration and told him not to remind me of my situation, but Ansgar stated that he had different intentions. He made me an offer to join him in France. I was stunned by his offer. Ansgar didn't stop there. He said he still had feelings for me, and if I married him, I could get citizenship. He offered me his hand and asked me to take his offer, because I'd be happier. My mind strolled back down memory lane. Heiner's promise to love me forever. Why did I remember that moment? I stuttered my next response. My husband wouldn't approve. Ansgar didn't back down. He said it'd be easier to move away once I got the divorce. Things weren't looking good for me, and he was my only option. I finally asked him to give me some time to think about his offer. It had come a little unexpected. Ansgar apologized for being too forward with his offer. He'd been looking forward to seeing me again, making his offer to me. He offered to give me his contact instead, and while he searched his pockets for his card, he recalled he was staying in a hotel. He took out a pen and a little note card and scribbled down his room number, saying I could come straight to him whenever I was ready. I couldn't help but notice that Ansgar had felt a bit unfamiliar a moment ago. But now, he's reverted to his old self, like when we were kids. I smiled as I received the note card from him, my mind traveling back to the past for a moment. Back to when I was ignorant. Ansgar made me promise to get back to him if I ever needed help. Once he was gone and the door was shut behind him, I couldn't help but wonder why Ansgar had come to me. I read the fine calligraphy of his name on one side of the card and turned to the other. Everything ran through my mind. Ansgar's family, his appointment as ambassador in France, his marriage, everything. I thought about my father, the king's nephew, and my royal lineage. And then I flinched instantly as a realization hit me. Was Ansgar reaching out to me for a restoration of the monarchy? Everyone who supported the monarchy in Padania had all been crushed by Heiner Waldemar. He'd won the heart of all Padania with the way he handled things after all the chaos that followed the revolution. Likewise, the nobles who'd fled to France needed help from outside forces. Ansgar's offering of his hand took on a new meaning to me. If it took his hand, I'd be able to help him and the other nobles. And it was also the right thing to do. My last chance to escape from Heiner. I sat down to a silent dinner with Heiner much later in the day. The air was pierced by nothing but the clatter of cutlery against china. I could feel the heat of Heiner's gaze on my skin while I toyed idly with my food. He finally broke the silence. He'd heard about Ansgar's visit to the residence. I paused, my hand hanging before my mouth. He asked what we talked about. I shifted my gaze to the floor and asked if he hadn't already heard everything from the staff anyway. They'd told him about Ansgar's visit, right? Heiner calmly stated that he wanted to hear it from me. I sighed and told him that Ansgar wanted me to move to France after finalizing the divorce. But Heiner jumped to his own conclusions instantly. He asked if I'd asked for the divorce because I wanted to be with Ansgar. I had to point out that I'd not seen Ansgar for years, more time than I'd known him for. But Heiner wasn't ready to let the matter rest. He said I could have been in touch with Ansgar behind his back. He'd not thought much of it in the past, but with Ansgar's visit, then it struck me, the letters. I confronted him about the letters, and Heiner instantly told me he had no business explaining himself to me. He added that I could never take Ansgar's hand, and I was never leaving the residence. The room fell back into silence. What had I expected? If Ansgar really was a part of the restoration forces, then Heiner would never hand me over. That was a fact. Maybe his reason for denying me the divorce was purely political, to have the legal advantage over his enemies. And I felt the same sense of duty myself. Ansgar wasn't any different from my husband. I was glad he'd visited, and I might have considered his offer in the past, but he also wanted to use me as a tool to win the battle because of my royal blood. I was only a tool to all these people. But I was done being used. I only wondered why Heiner's people disagreed with him. They wanted me and Heiner to get separated, even though I wanted that more than most people. So why didn't he want the same thing? I dressed up in preparation for church, putting on a veiled hat to hide my face from the public. I told the guard I met at the giant entrance doors that I didn't need an attendant, but he insisted that I needed Heiner's permission if I wanted to leave by myself. I told him I didn't want the stress, and just when he was about to carry on with his stubbornness, I lost it. I yelled and asked him if I needed permission to pray, and that finally seemed to drive the message home for him. He let me through, and I walked undisturbed out of the residence. I flagged down the first horse carriage rider I saw and asked to be taken to the Rochester station. I held my breath anxiously until I was safely seated in a carriage on the train. I didn't think I'd ever come close to other human beings in my life again. I prayed with all I had that the newspapers wouldn't carry my face by the next morning. I fell into silence, and from the corner of my eyes, I spotted an old lady making prayers through a sacred worship relic. I wondered what she could be praying so desperately for. I'd stayed away from church for far too long. Everyone had testimonies to share about how the gods answered their prayers. But my story was different. Nothing changed for me no matter how hard I prayed. I'd gotten tired of making the same prayers for salvation and forgiveness. There was no hope in that life for me. All I wanted now was to see the ocean like I did in my dreams. I let out a sigh and looked away from the old lady. I was startled by the sound of her voice moments later as she called out to me to ask what the matter was. I apologized and waved off her concerns, but the lady was persistent in a kind way, of course. She'd only asked because she'd heard me sigh heavily. She asked if I was going somewhere, and I told her I was going to see the ocean for a change of scenery. She seemed to find it mildly strange that I was going alone and not with a lover. I admitted to her that I was married, but I didn't get along so well with my husband, and we were talking about getting a divorce. She asked if we had any children, and I answered in the negative. The old lady tried to cheer me up and said it was almost very normal for young people to get a divorce, unlike in the past when people considered it a flaw. Then she jokingly added that the times had changed and even the aristocrats were all gone. I pursed my lips in tense silence. What would she do if she learned about my past, about my family? She broke through my thoughts by asking why I didn't get along with my husband. I was hesitant to share the details of my life with a total stranger, but eventually just let it all out. I told her that my husband and the people around him hated me so much that they wanted me dead, and I didn't want to live with him anymore either. She agreed in understanding. She knew what it felt like to be in my position. No one took being hated on lightly, but no one had any control over things like that. She added that life was better off lived for those who cared about us. I had my thoughts about her opinion. But even if I couldn't expect everyone to love me, I just didn't want them to despise me so much. And worse still, everyone who genuinely loved me was dead. What was left for me to do now? I finally got to the ocean side. The sun was setting, its fading light staining the skies a fiery orange that painted everything under it. The air was filled with the sound of seagulls calling, ocean water overlapping at the banks and the wind traveling through clothes and hair. It felt like stepping into a dream. An old one. How long had I been away from the ocean for? I hadn't been to the ocean since I got married to Heiner. Everything was so beautiful. I spotted a painter in the distance and contemplated asking if his work was for sale. As if he'd read my mind, he said he was selling the paintings and asked me to make my pick. While I was still contemplating whether or not to browse through the paintings, he offered to paint me for free. I was overwhelmed by surprise. Was it okay? I'd need to take my hat off if I accepted. That'd give my cover away. What if the painter recognized me right away? He seemed to notice the internal battle I was fighting, and then he offered to paint me with my hat on. That gave me the confidence to take the hat off. I wondered if he didn't know me or pretended not to. Whichever way, it was all good for me. I asked him how long it'd take for him to complete the painting. He jokingly said it wouldn't take too long and that I was asking too many questions for a freebie. Then he asked me for a smile. I was caught off guard by the suddenness of his request. It'd been a while since someone asked me to just smile. I tried a little twitch of my lips and asked if that was fine. But the painter teased me and made a funny face to mimic the way I'd been smiling. My face flushed with embarrassment when I saw it, and I tried a different expression. The painter instantly liked it and screamed enthusiastically. He painted and painted, while I sat silently, until he was done. When he handed the painting over to me, I was dumbstruck by its beauty. It looked too beautiful. Even more beautiful than I believed I looked. The painter laughed and jokingly said it had a mix of his skills and my already beautiful face. I told him I really loved it, but was too embarrassed to hang my own face up on the wall. I offered to buy a different painting instead, and the painter let me go ahead to make my pick. I'd been admiring a painting of the seaside since I bumped into the painter. He said it was the local sea in Glenford and praised my taste in art. I asked for the price, and he gave me a discount since I'd modeled for him. I thanked him as I paid for the painting. But I couldn't have known that what had been a fine evening was heading off to a sour turn. I walked along the shore, picking up seashells and storing them in the pocket of my blouse. Then for a moment, I felt the water pull me ever so gently, coaxing me to come in deeper. I held up my dress and kept moving forward, burying my body in the water 1 inch deeper with every step. And then suddenly, I lost my footing and was sure to fall into the ocean when a strong pair of arms caught me. I looked up into very stern yet familiar eyes Heiner's. He squeezed my shoulders hard and asked where I thought I was going. Only hours ago. Heiner had gotten wind of my little escape, every step I'd taken, from the carriage to the train to the oceanside. I hadn't known at the time, but a memo was passed out to every checkpoint and train station to be on the lookout for me whenever I went out by myself. They all reported directly to Heiner, so he could catch me at any time. He'd been with me every step of the way, even at the train station, but my attire couldn't have given off the impression that I was running away. He must have been confused as to what I hoped to achieve with my strange behavior. He must have suspected I'd gone to meet with Ansgar secretly, while I was headed to Glenford by myself. Heiner fought hard to keep from dragging me back to the residence, if only to know where I was headed. It wasn't difficult tailing me anyway. Heiner had most certainly listened in on my conversation with the old lady everything. And I bet the one thing he agreed the most with from our conversation was this: he couldn't care less what happened to me. Even if I died, he wouldn't care. He knew I had no one left who loved me or cared about me, at least. Well, except him. But I wouldn't have known this. I wouldn't have known he wished for us to be together till the very end. Even if what we shared wasn't love. Heiner kept an eye on me the whole time. My whole interaction with the painter. Everything. Even down to the time I'd laughed at the painter's mimicry of my face. Heiner hadn't seen me smile so hard in a long time. In fact, he hadn't seen me smile since after the days of our courtship. Heiner clenched his fist by his side. He was wasting too much time sitting by the sidelines and watching me. He wanted to grab me and haul me off to the residence. He couldn't stand seeing me happy or enjoying my freedom, however temporarily. He felt the urge to warn me that running off again would get me locked up as punishment. But something about my smile made his legs stop working momentarily. He pulled me out of the ocean and onto the shore. I kept my eyes to the ground and told him that I'd expected him to catch me earlier. Heiner brushed off my sarcastic comment and commanded me to put myself together immediately. I took a step in the direction of my things and stepped on a broken seashell buried in the sand. I let out a yelp of pain, and Heiner instantly materialized by my side. He shoved my things in my chest and hoisted me onto his shoulders before I could protest. I struggled to get down, stating that I could walk and that the injury was not as serious as it seemed, but Heiner calmly asked me to stay still. I flinched and finally settled into feet. Why was he so angry that I'd run away? I'd assumed he'd send one of his men after me and not come all the way. By himself. Heiner marched all the way to the hotel in the Glenford countryside and walked up to the front desk. He didn't mind that we were in a crowded place. I clung to him tightly, burying my face in his shoulder in embarrassment. Heiner grabbed me tighter against himself and booked us a room. Inside the room, he let my things drop to the floor in a loud clutter and carried me off to the bathroom, dropping me delicately into the bathtub. I quickly announced that I could wash myself before he had any ideas. It wouldn't have been unusual for him to. Heiner gently walked away, leaving me to clean myself up. I flinched in pain as the water stung my injury. The cut was deeper than I'd thought. Once I was done, I went out to find Heiner hunched by the bedside, a first aid kit by his feet. He nodded for me to come sit before him, and I obliged. He took my foot gently and bandaged the cut. In Pedania, nobles weren't supposed to show off their feet to anyone else. Even though I'd been married to Heiner for 3 years, we'd never really seen each other's bodies. I was red with embarrassment as he tugged on the bandage on my foot. He asked me what I'd been thinking. What had been so important to me that I'd had to lie to the attendant at the door? Just to come to a place like this? He looked up at me, accusation in his eyes as he hopped on another line of suspicion. I looked down at him innocently and explained that I'd only wanted to see the ocean. Heiner kept silent. Whether or not he'd believed me, he didn't say. Then he spoke. He'd thought I was going to meet Ansgar Stetter, but with the way I jumped into the ocean, there had to be more. I looked away in guilt and said I was only trying to soak my feet. He flashed me a smirk and said with every hint of sarcasm that he believed me, since I was scared of a lot of things. He listed them one by one like he'd memorized them and dismissed them off as trivial. He was angry that I couldn't bother to worry about what could happen to me while moving about without protection, leaving my property in the sand carelessly without fear that they could be stolen. Heiner added that he was sure I'd never had to watch my own things. He always had some bit of loathing to pour into the smallest reprimands. It was clear he despised me for the fortune my family had once enjoyed. I looked away from him in embarrassment and conceded in defeat. He was right after all. Heiner launched into a fit of rage, and in his frustration, he voiced the truth to my hearing. He'd always hated me for it. The world had changed, but I'd stubbornly refused to follow suit, so much that it drove him insane. He spat the next round of words like a snake's venom. I was the same disgusting aristocratic woman I'd always been. His words hurt me. How long had he hated me for? Had he always hated me? Even from the moment we first met? But beyond that, what did he think of my love for him? The answer left my lips accompanied by a bitter smile. He must have thought I was foolish. It was Heiner's turn to be stunned. I told him to think about everything. He'd played a man in love with a woman he despised, and that woman fell for it hook, line, and sinker. She'd even admitted she loved you too. It must have been a joke to him. I clenched my fists on my lap and continued. I asked Heiner the real question. If he'd truly despised me, why didn't he tell me 3 years ago, after the kingdom fell, and my parents died and he got everything he'd wanted? He could have told me. And even though he didn't tell me, I'd still loved him the same way for 3 years. Heiner's eyes were wide in shock as I dropped my own truth. The truth is, I'd always believed he'd come back. I believed he'd smile for me again, that he'd change his mind and love me again. But just how many more times did I have to pick myself up from the ground? Heiner was stunned and stuttered as he asked me the next question. Did I still love him? I was silent. I answered and told him I wasn't so sure. What was the point in it? It wouldn't change anything. My feelings were useless. I vowed aloud never to let anyone use me the way Heiner Waldemar had used me. Ever. After his outburst and my confession, I settled for a bath. Heiner had instructed an attendant to bring my luggage to the hotel. Did he plan to stay the night here? I asked him the question before I could think otherwise. Did he want to stay in the room with me? Heiner gave me a little glance before rising to his feet as he asked if I'd run away if he went somewhere else. I told him that's not what I meant. He shot me a glare and warned me against leaving. He threatened to have the attendant drag me back if I did. And with that, he left the room, banging the door behind him. I stayed on the large bed by myself, lost in thought. If Heiner was so busy, because I'd seen him with paperwork even in the hotel, why did he come to get me in person? He had many attendants in his service and many more loyal followers who would jump to do his bidding if he gave the order. And why was he so angry? I was so confused. Did he not want to see me at all? Or did hate me so much to want me to live in despair before his very eyes? Forever? I gave up on a conclusive answer. Heiner came into the room moments later and was surprised to find me still awake. I told him I couldn't sleep. When I reached for my sleeping pills, he grabbed my arm. He asked me if I'd been taking the pills every time I couldn't sleep and reasoned that they couldn't be good for me. I sighed and told him I wouldn't take them if I could. Heiner angrily grabbed the envelope of pills and yelled for me to stop taking them. He asked if I wanted to get addicted. Heiner made me stay still. All I could think of was the irritation in his voice. It was always the same whenever he got angry. The old Heiner was never like this. Sure, we'd had our differences as a couple, but they never lasted longer than a thought. And Heiner was always the one to apologize first. Then he'd hold me close and kiss me. Gosh, he was such a great actor, pretending just to get to my father. I know it was no good, but I couldn't stop thinking about the past. Heiner handed me a mug of something steaming hot and assured me that it'd help me sleep. I shyly asked him what it was, and he said it was chamomile tea. It was warm. While I silently sipped the tea, Heiner announced that he was going to look through my things. I looked at him in surprise, but he didn't stop. Heiner was looking through my things. This was new. He spotted the pills right away and asked why I had so many of them. They looked like sleeping pills. I told him some were painkillers and others were digestive medication. Heiner quickly cut in and asked what Dr. Burkle had to say. I told him exactly what the man had said. I was too sensitive. Heiner didn't seem surprised. He must have thought it was true, what the doctor had said. He searched through the luggage some more and found Ansgar's note card. He studied it closely without saying a word. I quickly jumped in to speak about Ansgar, before he made the usual conclusions. I asked Heiner if there really was a restoration force in Franz like Ansgar had said. Heiner was surprised. He asked if Ansgar had told me about this force and about joining him since they wanted to restore the monarchy. I told Heiner I'd only just thought about it myself. I wasn't hiding anything from him, and I had no plans to follow Ansgar. Heiner wasn't quite convinced. Ansgar still had feelings for me, and he was unmarried. Heiner said he wouldn't let me leave because I now had a place to go, and he was certain I'd gain nothing by telling him the truth. I mused over his words silently before asking him if he hadn't set out with the intention of making the world a better place. Because despite his cruelty to me, everyone thought Heiner had made the world a better place. And while I couldn't understand, everyone else said things were going to get even better. Heiner walked up close to me, planting his hands on the bed either side of me. He snapped and told me he didn't need my pity. He asked me not to think at all. He'd done just fine until now. I was too drained to deal with his sudden change of emotions. I calmly repeated that I wasn't going with Ansgar whether or not he believed me. I was tired and I had to sleep. And Heiner let me sleep, even though I could feel the heat of his eyes on me most of the night. While I slept, Heiner pulled the blanket over my body. He didn't find it comfortable staying with me in the same room. He regretted it, in fact. He battled the wave of thoughts that came flooding his mind before he couldn't help it any longer. He went snooping around my things again, searching for nothing in particular until he noticed a bulge in my clothes from the beach. He dipped his hand inside the pocket and pulled out the seashells I'd gathered at the beach. He didn't see the beauty I saw in them because they went straight into the trash basket. Heiner stepped out to the balcony and pulled a smoke piece up to his lips. He mimicked the huffing sound he'd make on a drag if it was lit and let out a long exhale. He felt a little better afterwards. Heiner had given up smoke pieces when he'd first met me, but he liked to hold them in his mouth in dark, confined spaces. Since we'd both been very honest to each other only moments ago, Heiner saw no need to impress anymore. He could just light the piece and enjoy it. But he couldn't. Even if he tried to deny it, I made him feel the most vulnerable and miserable with no end. He let the smoke piece drop to the floor and returned to the room. He peeked at the trash again, and the shells seemed to remind him of our exchange from earlier, how I'd said my feelings were useless. Heiner thought otherwise. Because he wished for me to feel despair and misery when they weren't reciprocated, just like he'd felt in the past. That was his sole mission for being with me. A few days later, I was going through the records and stumbled on the Citizens Association donation log. Right behind the document sat a jewelry box, the real reason I'd gone searching in the safe. I picked up its content and walked out to the car. I asked the driver if there were any jewelry stores around that weren't swamped up, and he recommended one, but quickly added that I'd have to walk a bit because the store was in a narrow alley. I didn't have a problem with walking. He drove off, and in less than no time we arrived at the store. He waited for me outside while I went into the store alone. The storekeeper welcomed me and asked how he could help me. I searched my bag and told him I'd come to sell some jewelry. He asked me to place them on a tray, and I did as I was told. I waited while he slipped on his glasses to see them properly. He gasped at their beauty almost immediately. Heiner had always known how much I adored shiny things, so no matter how expensive, he always got me something whenever we went out on a date. I could still recall the story behind every single piece before me, the swan most especially. When Heiner had got it for me, I gushed over its beauty, and he told me he'd bought it because it reminded him of me. I told him my room was swelling with all his many gifts, and if I got any more, I'd most likely get buried under them. But Heiner, as sweet as ever, was quick to reassure me with that misleading softness in his voice. He only wanted for me to have all the shiny things my heart desired. Of course, I'd fallen for it and even asked him if he were proposing to me. Heiner promised to make the proposal even more impressive, and I, like a silly lovesick princess, soaked up all of it and asked if I could look forward to it. The world had seemed so beautiful at the time. As Heiner's wife, nearly all my belongings as a Rozenberg, and even those I'd gotten as Annette Waldemar, had either gotten seized or donated. But after everything, I believed it was only right to let them all go. I didn't want to be remembered by them after my death. The storekeeper's voice brought me out of my reverie. The quotes were ready. After weighing them, they all amounted to merely 2,300 pounds. The storekeeper asked if I had any questions, and I told him I didn't. But as I glanced at the diamond ring on my finger, I had a different idea. I considered selling the ring as well. The storekeeper examined it closely and said it had cost probably over 7,000 pounds. But he apologized and explained that the store couldn't afford to buy something so expensive. I'd have to try a bigger store. I took the ring back with a hint of disappointment in my voice. But 2,300 didn't sound like enough money. I'd never had to live by my means in my life, but I knew without being told that the money wouldn't last anyone a few years. I examined the ring again and figured it made sense that the jewelry I'd managed to sell fetched me 2,300 pounds despite their small size. But to think that the ring alone cost 7,000 was just too much to process. I couldn't recall ever owning an item so expensive, not even in my days as a Rozenberg. Did Heiner make the mistake of proposing with an expensive ring because he thought I'd be sad otherwise? After all, he'd called me an airheaded woman, born into a wealthy family with no clue what happened in the world, a vain woman who got everything she wanted. Maybe he was right. I picked the money realized from the sales and exited the store. I walked with my driver along the alley to the car. From the corner of my vision, I noticed a man standing underneath a lamppost. Was he looking at me? I wasn't comfortable with his gaze. Then suddenly, without warning, he pulled out a firearm and aimed at me. I was too stunned to react quickly or get out the plea forming at the back of my throat. He fired a couple of times more than I could remember as I dropped to the ground. My driver jumped into alert and pulled out his own weapon to return the assault. He scared the attacker away before turning back to me. In my state of pain, I could hear the driver ask if I was all right. I held my side in agony and looked in horror when I pulled my hand away to reveal blood. My blood! I groaned in discomfort, fighting to stay alive. Did getting shot hurt this bad, or was I imagining the pain? I'd heard Heiner got shot 3 times. Did he hurt just like I was hurting now? My stomach felt like it was burning. I recalled the look in my attacker's eyes full of hate. I wondered why he didn't aim for my head instead if he despised me so much. While I was knocked out cold and unconscious, the driver called Heiner right in the middle of a meeting and reported the situation to him. I was in a hospital, but the doctor said I was not in critical condition. Heiner wasted no time and asked for the address of the hospital. He instructed an attendant to prepare the car and dismissed his meeting prematurely. An attendant led him to the prepared car and he called out the address of the hospital where I was with urgency. The attendant wasted no time in zooming off. Heiner put a smoke piece between his lips to ease off the building tension while he mulled over the words that had disrupted his fine morning. I'd been shot, but not in critical condition. He tapped his foot restlessly on the floor of the car. Once he arrived at the hospital, Heiner marched straight up to the front desk and demanded to see me. The nurse quickly offered to lead him to me. They walked through the hospital corridors and came to a stop at the room where I was. Heiner looked at my unconscious form wordlessly. The attending physician introduced himself immediately, and Heiner asked how I was. The doctor responded saying that I'd been brought in just in time to take care of the situation, and the wound wasn't deep, so it was going to heal quickly. But he had some sad news. I'd been in my first trimester at 11 weeks, but miscarried. I'd been pregnant. It was the after effect of the surgical procedure to save my life. Heiner stared in shock and disbelief. Heiner asked the doctor to repeat himself, and he stuttered the same words. I'd miscarried. Heiner was livid. He asked to confirm I'd been pregnant. The doctor seized the moment to also break more bad news. I might never conceive again. I was very weak, and if they'd induced labor, I might never have lost the ability to have kids ever. Heiner's mind reeled endlessly with the words he'd just heard. Pregnant, miscarried, 11 weeks. I'd met Heiner many times in the past, just to ask him to make love to me. I'd made requests like that a little frequently, and Heiner figured I'd convince myself that a child could mend our broken marriage. But I'd never gotten pregnant in 4 years. Not even once. The doctors had branded me weak, so Heiner never really thought I could conceive at all. But to get pregnant? That was a whole different level. The doctor assured Heiner that I'd wake up soon and the pregnancy tissue would pass naturally. Our child was only a tissue. Heiner instructed him not to let anyone else know about the incident, and the doctor agreed before asking if he had any more questions. Heiner hesitated a bit before bringing up my insomnia and how it had become worse in recent times. He asked if the pregnancy had contributed to it, and the doctor answered speculatively by saying the first trimester came with many symptoms. Heiner wasn't satisfied with his vague answer. He explained in more detail that I may have had trouble sleeping, suffered from indigestion and headaches as well. He clenched his fists by his sides as he spoke. Heiner told the doctor about my pills and asked if he could replace them with better ones. The doctor was quick to oblige and offered to help if Heiner needed anything else. Heiner could tell from the quiver in the doctor's voice that he was somewhat afraid of him. He'd certainly heard the rumors about him about us. Heiner's rigidness and our failing marriage. Exactly 3 months ago. I'd gone to Heiner's room to ask if he was busy, and he knew what I really needed. It was always me seeking after him, and never the other way around. Why couldn't he just say if he didn't want me at all? I didn't mind him rejecting my touch, my kisses, or kicking me out instead of holding me close. I stepped out of my clothes, and even with all of my skepticism, I still hoped he didn't say no. I still hoped he didn't reject me. I hoped he didn't send me away. when our bodies met on the softness of his bed. I longed to reach him, the real him, because I knew he'd leave me behind like crumbs once we were done. My eyes finally flickered open, and I looked around, disoriented. My stomach still hurts like I'd only just been shot. Heiner was by my bedside. And he looked different. He looked unlike himself. Both him and the doctor stared at me with confused glances on their faces before the doctor revealed the truth all of it. My mind raced back to all the signs I'd missed. I'd been unwell lately, but I'd blame myself for being too sensitive like Dr. Burkle had said. I'd wanted to carry Heiner's child so badly. And just when I'd finally succeeded, Heiner reassured me that the public would never find out about the incident. He promised to take care of it, so I didn't need to worry. According to him, the culprit had been arrested on the scene and an investigation had been launched to find out his intentions and accomplices. Because of the incident, Heiner had temporarily restricted the use of firearms for civilians, and since I'd been pregnant, the culprit could be charged for taking a life. I cut him off with 2 words: the child. I wanted to know how many weeks along the child was before the incident. Heiner answered and said 11 weeks. I figured it had to have been on that night, 3 months ago. That was the night I'd finally conceived. Heiner was quick to make a pacifying offer. If I was open to it, we could always adopt children. His words finally struck me. Adopt? Why did we need to adopt children? What was he not telling me? Heiner stared at me and with a directness that seemed rather passive, tried explaining the logic behind his suggestion. But he didn't need to. I stopped him. I mean, he didn't want to begin with. I was pretty certain he'd never even thought about having kids with me. It was better off this way. Heiner was confused, but I put it to him pretty straight. The child would have been unhappy if it had survived. And that was the truth. I could already imagine the many things that had been so wrong with its upbringing. A loveless home under the shadows of the Rozenberg family name. The pills I took during the pregnancy might have deformed it somehow as well. I looked up at Heiner and asked him the one big question. Wasn't he actually glad the child had died? He was stunned, speechless. He'd never have imagined I'd be so direct with him. But he admitted eventually that he'd never thought about having children before. The doctors had told him I'd find it difficult getting pregnant, and to be fair enough, for the first 4 years of our marriage that held true. But still, I asked him again if he didn't feel better that I was barren. A high-figure political leader wouldn't need a child to get in the way of all that, right? His features were rigid, and I could almost feel his thoughts ripple towards me like a river. He'd never love a child conceived by me for very obvious reasons. Then he asked if I'd wanted a child, but my mind was numb now from the loss. Did it really matter now? Whether or not I wanted one, did it really matter to him? He seemed visibly disturbed by my question and tried to explain himself in defense. But I cut him off bluntly and flipped the table at him. What did he mean by his question? Heiner brought up the adoption option again, making it seem like he was doing me a great service, an act of mercy because I really wanted a child. But I'd lost it with him already. I yelled and told him that I didn't want a child anymore. How much louder could I be to drive my point home? He'd wanted it this way, hadn't he? So why was he having a change of heart all of a sudden? I soon ran out of air and words to hurl at him from my broken heart. I lay back down on the bed and asked to be left alone. Heiner kept silent before leaving the room moments later. Alone, my thoughts raged about inside my head. I blamed everything on myself. My greed, my loneliness, and desperation. It had to be those. Or maybe because I didn't want to lose him. Yeah, the reality was stark as day. A child born to us would have faced a cold, harsh world. Simply because it had my blood. That was all the truth I needed to know and believe. The child didn't deserve parents like us. But why? Why did it hurt so much? Why did it feel like a part of me was lost forever? A couple of days later, I and Heiner were in the doctor's office, waiting for his final report. The bleeding had stopped and my wounds were almost completely healed. I was clear to leave anytime after the following day. But there was more. Heiner had reported my pill addiction and had the doctor look into its contents. The pills were contraindicated for early pregnancy. I could feel the heat of Heiner's gaze on my head as I looked down in a bit of shame and, well, acceptance. Apparently, all my symptoms had only been signs of pregnancy. Normal pregnant women problems. The signs were there. When the doctor asked if my former physician had mentioned the possibility of pregnancy, I realized that he hadn't. The doctor gave me a new prescription for my sleep and the migraines. I realized that I'd never really known what I'd been taking the whole time. But it was already pretty too late for that now. I could feel the tension in Heiner's voice when we got to the hospital room. He said he was going to hire a new physician, but I didn't think it was necessary. Heiner was still upset. He was upset that the physician had missed the pregnancy the whole time and misdiagnosed me. But I didn't really care anymore. The child was gone after all, wasn't it? Heiner was enraged by my new indifference to his perceived kindness, but he was just adding to the throb in my head because I couldn't figure out why it bothered him anyway. I told him blankly to fire the physician if he wished to. It was none of my business anyway. Heiner brought down his voice to say the next few words he would say to me. An apology for everything that had happened. But you know what it sounded like? Empty words of consolation to a random stranger he'd paid some condolence visit to. That's what. A sad smirk kissed my lips. I realized my anger was not for him. In fact, I didn't feel angry at all. Even anger was a futile feeling. I told him that I wanted to be discharged as soon as possible, but Heiner reasoned that I needed some. More rest and psychological counseling. I didn't have the strength to argue with him. I accepted his terms. All I needed was to be discharged once the papers were ready. Heiner sighed and promised to get it done, but he'd barely finished speaking when his eyes caught a detail he'd been missing the whole time. My ring. It was gone. He asked me and I almost told him a story. The old me would have. But not anymore. I simply told him I'd taken it off because it was all pointless now. I noticed the tension in his face, the pure anger, the clenching of fists and slight gritting of teeth to show his displeasure. But he left without saying anything on the matter. Only a little instruction to get some rest. Days passed and things had changed with them. The truth is, nothing is ever hidden. Heiner did well to keep the miscarriage a secret, but nobody would have believed the shooting never took place. It became viral. It was raining. It had been raining all morning. Just outside the hospital, there was a sea of gossip-hungry reporters, standing under their umbrellas and waiting for their turn to pick my private life apart from their newspaper. The sheer irony of everything hit me hard. Heiner had been indifferent when the critics were bashing me for my family's involvement in the war. But now, he'd gotten the whole city interested in telling my story. Maybe because my life was threatened. He walked into the room and said he'd gotten everything I'd need into the car so we could leave. We had a court hearing in a couple of hours. As we made our exit from the hospital room, Heiner advised me not to speak to the reporters. Cameras flashed in response to our arrival. Questions flew about in the air. I could hear a few dozen people speaking all at once. It was driving me nuts. It felt like drowning in a really deep ocean. Until it didn't. I heard one voice that stood out. From behind, someone called out to me loudly, her voice rising above the noise. Nothing would have prepared me for her introduction. Here I was, standing face to face with the sister of the shooter, David Burkle. I was stunned to learn that the man even had a name. But I was more surprised that his sister wanted to speak with me. The press turned their attention to the lady instantly. They had a lot of questions, some important, others just right out of their hunger for gossip. But the lady yelled again, her voice rising above the noise as she stated her intent. She hadn't come at her brother's request. She'd come to see me personally. I was even more surprised. She explained that it had been her only choice because she couldn't reach me, and an interview with the reporters was the last thing on her mind. Heiner was done hearing her. He commanded the crowd of reporters to get out of the way and let me through to the car. Behind me, David's sister called out, saying she hoped to hear from me soonest. But by the time she'd finished speaking, I was tucked away in the car and ready to leave. On the ride home, I racked my head, trying to remember where I'd seen the lady before. Her face felt awfully familiar. I couldn't place who she was where she belonged. And more importantly, if she was right to hold a grudge against me. If she was one of the many other people I'd hurt just by merely existing. I couldn't tell these days. But try as I did, I just couldn't remember. I was pretty certain she wasn't an acquaintance. But wait, would I be right to trust my mind in my current state anyway? Was I even sane? I had to speak out before the thoughts would eventually drive me insane. I asked Heiner if he had any idea why the lady was looking for me. What would she want to talk about with me personally? Heiner waved it off as a woman trying to plead for pardon on behalf of her brother, and nothing more. But I felt there was more to it. Why did the woman claim to have tried reaching me without success? Heiner looked away in guilt and admitted she'd sent some letters. Only a few. In his defense, he explained that I was a victim and a patient, and I didn't need to be bothered by the letters while I was recovering. I looked at him, my voice lighter than I'd have liked, and told him to let me be the judge of that. He'd done something similar before, hidden a letter meant from me. Heiner felt silent as I confronted him with the truth. I made up my mind what I wanted to do. I wanted to meet with her. Heiner was confused. I was willing to put the letters all in the past, like they'd never even come. Heiner asked if they also wouldn't matter in the future, and I turned to observe him. To observe him. Why would this man assume I wanted a future with him? What even was his picture of the future? I simply disregarded his question and asked him to get me the lady's contact information to make up for missing the letters. Heiner accepted in defeat, but only on the condition that the guards would accompany me to my meeting with the lady. Perhaps a small price to pay for having my way. A few days passed, and Heiner honored my request. I studied her profile. Her name was Catherine Groth, and she'd been married for barely 6 months. She ran a fruit shop with her husband. As detailed as the information was, it still didn't help me remember the lady. I didn't think she'd like me either. I considered ignoring the woman entirely. While I struggled to make a decision, I heard chatter from under my window. Heiner and Amelie were leaving, together. And Heiner, being the typical gentleman, asked to help her with the heavy files she'd been carrying. I recalled my conversation with Heiner about the proposal he'd received from her. He'd declined it, according to his words that night. But whatever the case was, I couldn't trust him after being played for a fool. I wondered just how much of the Heiner I knew was the real Heiner. As if he could feel the heat of my eyes, he suddenly turned and looked up at my window. Our eyes met briefly before he turned away like I didn't matter. I clenched my fist and made up my mind what to do. I walked over to the house phone and dialed the number I'd been given for Catherine Groth. Her husband answered. I gave him a message for her. She could come around anytime she was ready. I'd left instructions with the guards already, so all she had to do was state her identity. He acknowledged my message and promised to relay it to his wife. I couldn't shake off the last time we'd met back at the hospital. Just when the crowd of reporters were everywhere, she'd just stood out. That alone got me curious. I had to hear what she had to say, because I couldn't count on getting another chance to do so. A chance to get a glimpse of the life I'd been oblivious to. Later in the day, Heiner brought in the new physician, an old lady named Milla Loren. I welcomed her with a little smile, and while I introduced myself as Mrs. Waldemar, I wondered if using Heiner's last name was still appropriate given all that had happened. Heiner seemed to notice the conflict in my mind, but we were both spared the awkwardness by Milla, who'd apparently been briefed on everything that had happened. And Heiner had also mentioned the psychological counseling nonsense to her. But I didn't need any of it. Milla tried to persist politely, but I insisted that I didn't really need it. No, I didn't want it. The fact that something was wrong with my mind wasn't news to me. Every time I faced some heavy stress, I always found myself staggering between reality and dreams. Every time. Maybe everyone was right, and I'd really gone insane. I was scared of confirming their suspicions all the same. Milla nodded in understanding, but not without leaving me a questionnaire so I'd reconsider. I reluctantly accepted her offer. She was only doing her job after all. Once she was gone, Heiner tried to convince me to get psychological counseling, but I highly doubted it was all so simple. It couldn't be. Not after Heiner himself had threatened to lock me up in a psych ward forever. Heiner tried to explain that he'd only made that threat because I'd been rebelling a lot at the time. But come on. Rebelling? I was rebelling? Was that all everything looked like to him? I was rebelling simply because I'd asked for a divorce? Surely he thought I was a child. I snapped at him to quit treating me as an inferior. But Heiner stopped me from speaking and said I was the one who thought him to be inferior. I was confused. When did I ever give him that impression? Heiner let out a loud sigh and reassured himself that he wasn't about to pick another fight with me. But I was even more confused now. He'd just cut our conversation short without giving me closure. And like the old Heiner I remembered, he asked me to fill out the consultation form for Dr. Loren. With that, he turned and walked away, banging the door behind him. I wondered again to myself what purpose my life had. By the following day, Catherine Groth decided to honor my invitation. Heiner came by himself to inform she was in the house. I asked him to make sure I had some privacy with the lady, but of course he didn't agree to that. Well, guess who'd grown a little resistance of her own? I insisted, and very firmly at that. Heiner finally accepted my request, but with the condition that Catherine would be thoroughly searched while I'd keep a weapon on me the whole time. I looked at the knife as he dropped it into my hands before leaving me alone. Catherine was in the reception room when I got there. She quickly rose to her feet to bow in respect once she saw me. There was a bit of awkwardness in the air initially, with both of us just stuttering over each other simultaneously. Eventually, I asked her to take her seat. Catherine asked how I was feeling, and I told her I was much better. Then my eyes caught it, a detail I'd missed in all the chaos of the reporters back at the hospital. She was pregnant. Catherine followed my line of sight, and she placed a hand on her bump. She was 5 months along already. I offered her an awkward congratulations, as I figured in my head that it'd make sense for her to be pregnant since she was newlywed. She couldn't have known about my miscarriage, but it was all her brother's fault. I couldn't help but feel jealousy and contempt, even for the child yet unborn. Could a child like that be blessed? No one would ever hear about mine, and here she was, basking in all the glory of her pregnancy. Of course, I wanted so badly to make this lady feel the weight of my pain, of the loss her brother had brought me. But what would that change? Catherine finally spoke and broke the silence. She'd expected me to be more arrogant and self-righteous. And when I asked her why, her reply was pretty simple. I was an only child. What did that have to do with anything anyway? But as the only daughter of Marquis Rozenberg, it wasn't entirely out of line for her to make such an assumption. For all she knew, she could be correct. Maybe it never really occurred to me. Catherine asked if I had any cousins. I knew a few, but they were hardly family. Not really close. Catherine had 2 brothers, one older and the other younger. She talked about how they'd always fight and still get along at the end of the day, just like every other family. Her older brother went to college and became a trading expert. He'd always had ambition, always very eager to climb up the social ladder. But whatever effort he put into his job, he never got promoted. The branch manager at his company was a greedy, condescending noble who stole the contributions for himself. Her brother had let it all slide until he couldn't. Not after the noble promoted his own son. No, Catherine's brother couldn't take that. It made him join the revolutionary forces. My heart skipped a beat at the revelation. Catherine went on. The name of the group her brother joined downplayed the viciousness of their belief. They were all people like her brother. They didn't join because they wanted to be part of something bigger. No, not at all. They were just ordinary, unremarkable people. At this point, I wasn't so sure I wanted to hear the rest of the story. Catherine couldn't have known the struggle in my heart because she continued speaking. She'd never really fancied getting involved because she hardly knew anything about the group anyway. Her brother was hardly important in the group either. Sadly, there was a rebel manhunt only 5 years earlier, and they'd taken her brother. He was accused of being a spy for a hostile nation. And guess who was the head of the interrogation? Marquis Rozenberg, my father. Interrogation was a nice way to put the evil thing Catherine's brother had seen at his hands because it looked more like torture. He was sentenced to execution. Immediately after passing the decree, my father had taken off like he had an urgent matter to attend to. Was this really the past I'd been itching to hear? The truth I'd been searching for? The past I was oblivious to? Catherine continued. The day her brother was executed coincided with the day of my piano recital. I clasped my hand against my mouth in horror. I could still recall the events of that night quite clearly. Vividly. Everyone was full of so much praise for me, including my mother. I could recall seeing my father discussing in hushed tones with an officer under his ranks, briefly before he acted like it had been nothing. I hadn't given it much thought back then, but I'd walked up to my father, concerned that his countenance was not fitting for all the merriment in the air. Apparently, someone was out front, making a scene because of some trial results he'd been part of. He casually waved it away as an act of foolishness by the peasants who might as well be the criminals, the single problem with society in his own opinion. He didn't want me worrying about any of it, and I didn't. I trusted my father anyway, so what need was there to worry? I headed out to the balcony, still thinking about the performance and all I could do to get it even better in the future. And there, just in front of the gates, there she was, the commotion my father had spoken about. Catherine. I watched as the guards pulled away forcefully, her agonized wailing filling the air like the echoes of a passing train. Her eyes locked on mine, and I genuinely felt scared. It felt like taking a peek into a person's private space, seeing their nakedness, their lowest state. I nearly jumped over the railing in fright when Ansgar approached me from behind. He'd called, but I was too engrossed in the scene just outside the gates to hear him. My eyes trailed down to the ground outside where the woman had left her scarf. Her brother was shot by the next morning. Catherine's voice brought me back to the present. She couldn't appeal. It wasn't a real trial to begin with. Just a sentence and execution. The memory came washing back in full force. Catherine admitted that she'd been excited to hear about the downfall of the royal family. She'd hoped my father would apologize at least, probably even pay for his crimes, like he truly deserved. But she was heartbroken to see the news of his death in the papers by the next morning. A group of zealous revolutionaries had shot him dead in his mansion. Just like that. Without an apology. No closure. Then she finally got down to the real reason why she'd come. Her brother, David, the shooter. He'd committed a crime and was deserving of any punishment that had come his way. Catherine knew that. But she just wanted to tell me her own side of the story of how her brother died. I was shocked. She asked if she was allowed to blame me for my father's sins. She reassured me that she didn't think I was guilty in any way. With that, she rose to her feet, apologized for everything that had happened to me once again, and turned to take her leave. As she walked away, I finally began processing the story. I'd finally gotten to hear it. The reason why I was so hated. The truth I'd been oblivious to. And then the words left my lips before I could hold them back. I'm sorry. I couldn't stop saying it. I'm sorry. Catherine offered a simple, all right, in response. That was all she really needed. Someone to apologize for the wrong that had been done to her. I cried my eyes out. The whole time, I'd assumed I didn't need to understand what I shared in common with the lady. And frankly, I was quite convinced there was nothing. But it had been there the whole time. We did in fact share a moment. A noblewoman and a commoner. A woman with big dreams and a fruit seller. The family of the executioner and the family of the executed. But there was something missing. It still didn't help me fully understand why. The reason why, because I desperately wanted to be the judge of everything. But then reality hit me. I couldn't change anything about the past. By evening of that same day, I was in Heiner's office to do the unthinkable. Petition to pardon David Burkell. Heiner couldn't believe his ears. He was almost certain Catherine had bewitched me. I didn't argue with him. There was no energy for that. I simply reminded him that it was only my right to decide whether or not I wanted to press charges against the man who tried to kill me. Heiner was disappointed. Was I trying to be a saint? I smiled sadly. He knew me better than that. I'd rather not care. But this was personal. Different. While I was speaking, Heiner caught me smiling and confessed that he'd not seen me smile like that in a long time. I caught myself in a moment of self-awareness and apologized to him. I apologized for everything I'd done. Everything. Heiner's lips curled in a smirk that didn't seem to be pleasant as he asked if I had any clue why I was really apologizing for. But I didn't. All I knew was everyone hated me for being my father's daughter. And now I knew that they were all within their rights to do so. Heiner asked me not to bother apologizing to him ever. An apology was too easy. I was done fighting anyway. I excused myself and went back to my room to run myself a bath. My innocence was lost forever. I was born wrong, raised wrong. The price for my history and my existence was just too much, and yet I had to pay it. And one thing was very clear. I stepped into the tub. One thing clear on my mind. Heiner still wanted his revenge. My presence would only always make him unhappy. Maybe he really wanted to live a miserable and abnormal life. Maybe. I was more than willing now to grant him his wish. I picked up the knife he'd given me earlier. I'd reached the end of my road. His voice echoed in my mind as I pulled out the knife from its case. He'd asked me not to think about anything, right? But how was that even possible? My life itself was a problem to everyone as it was. It made more sense for me to end it. As I held the knife up, I recalled the first thought that flashed through my mind when Heiner handed it to me. Him. It reminded me of him. Holding that thought in my mind, I slashed the blade of the knife against my wrist and relaxed into the tub, ready to meet the end. My end. His revenge was successful after all. Meanwhile, while I closed my eyes to welcome death, to finally take a break from the misery that had plagued my life, Heiner was in his office doing more interesting things. He held up the petition I'd written on behalf of David Burkell against an old letter I'd written to him in the past, one of many. And he couldn't help but notice the difference in the pattern of writing. My handwriting had grown to become a mess. He read to himself from an old letter I wrote to him, one time after we'd just had a fight. He'd sent me a gift in apology, as if that'd make everything go away. While I loved the jewelry he'd gotten me, I still made it clear that he had to put in some more effort to understand women. Not just me. I used to think about him all the time, about our next meeting, what dress I'd put on. I was always so excited to see him. The littlest things would make me think about him, about us, our relationship and future together. I didn't know how to say sorry back then. I didn't understand. Remember? So I was always somewhat sorry, because I really liked him. It made putting my pride aside to say that a little easier. A lot, actually. As Heiner glanced through the letters, a smile kissed his lips. He couldn't stop thinking about me all the time as well. He caught himself as he assessed the pile of letters he'd kept all these years. A reminder of his happiest days, moments we'd shared which, unknown to me, were only an act. But perhaps, even in every lie, there's a bit of a truth. But as he continued thinking about me, something didn't sit quite right. I'd never been one to apologize. Never. I'd rather send a letter instead of saying it. And my letters always began with a chastise, a reason why the other party was wrong and I was right. Because of my pride that made me somewhat sorry. But that was it. Never a real apology. Then the thought suddenly crossed his mind that I might have done the unspeakable. I'd attempted it once by the beach, so who was to say I couldn't do it again? A lot had changed about me. With that awareness, he rose to his feet and marched out of his office. The whole time, he puzzled himself about how and when I'd changed so much. The first set of people his gaze fell on were the maids along the hallway. When he asked after me, they said I'd gone up to my room after complaining of fatigue. The alarm bells went ringing in his head instantly, and his steps took on some more urgency as he bolted down to my room. He knocked firmly at first, but when there was no answer forthcoming, he began banging loudly until he had to ram his way through the door. He was welcomed by deafening silence in the large room. While he wanted to believe I'd never do a thing as silly as taking my own life, all the signs were starting to point at it glaringly. He screamed my name louder. But I wouldn't have heard this at the time because I was already on my way to the other side of life. He barged his way into the bathroom and paused in horror at the sight that welcomed him. There I was the whole time, laying almost dead in a tub full of water and my blood. He dashed over to my side and lifted my hand, his eyes wide in horror as he confirmed his worst fears. A maid walked in on us and was instantly horrified as well. Heiner instructed her to fetch the doctor at once. He couldn't let me go. Not so easily. He scooped me out of the tub and into his arms, carrying me all the way to the bed while he tried everything possible to stop the bleeding. Dr. Lauren came as fast as she could, taking in the scene with horror in her eyes as well. Heiner screamed for her to save my life, by any means possible. The house was filled with the anxious murmurs of the staff. Heiner watched in tense silence as Dr. Lauren did her best to save my life. Heiner vowed to keep me alive at all costs, most especially because he didn't think I'd yet paid the weight of my debts in full. Or so he'd like to think. But in all honesty, he just didn't want to live without me. Heiner shut his eyes to sleep, and when he opened them again, he was somewhere else. Somewhere frozen in time. And there I was, skipping merrily by his side. As usual, I just wanted to know what was on his mind, what was going on in his perfectly beautiful head. He gave me the most honest and vulnerable answer he'd ever given me. He'd been thinking about me, our first meeting, and it went far back before I could even remember. He'd first seen me in the rose garden a long time ago. Well, he'd been spying on me, and then he heard me playing the piano. I couldn't have remembered because I was only a girl then. Heiner flinched, his eyes snapping wide open. He'd been dreaming. About me. Days passed and I remained unconscious. Heiner was starting to get impatient. Worried. Dr. Lauren explained that the incident coupled with the gunshot wound and miscarriage had sent my body into shock. But that wasn't all. My body actually needed my will to heal. But given the events that had led up to this point, there were heavy clouds of doubt. Heiner was still in shock. He'd never have imagined I'd do something as brazen as taking my own life. That, for him, was the highest act of rebellion. The embodiment of fear and weakness. All my phobias, heights, darkness, even blood. Yeah, these were all signs of my weakness, but he blamed it all on my upbringing. Heiner's thoughts were at war within him. A part of him, the selfish part that was truly the one I knew, gloated about the fact that he'd finally succeeded in making me so unhappy I found living unbearable. It was all he'd wanted after all, right? The better thing to say was, congratulations and perhaps a merry little party. Scratch that. A wild party, right? No. Heiner couldn't live with himself. He couldn't accept that I left his life on my own terms and not his. That was highly unacceptable. But what did he really want? How did he really want it all to end? Even Heiner himself didn't know the answer to that question. Gossip always flies fast, like chaff in the wind. News about my attempted suicide was soon on the front page of every newspaper. The headlines were horrible, unforgiving as usual. I couldn't even attempt to take my own life in peace. While I lay in my room, still unconscious, Heiner had to deal with the growing crowd of reporters outside the house. It sickened him to watch them loiter around the place. A visitor came around for me, but Heiner expressly asked for them to be sent away. But this person was persistent with their request. They'd settle for a meeting with him instead. That got Heiner somewhat interested. When he asked to know who this person was, he learned it was none other than Ansgar Stetter. Of course, Ansgar. He'd come around to visit me in the past, but Heiner didn't let him in. And now, he was going to do the same, but my voice kept ringing in his head, and even though Ansgar was the last person he wanted to see, Heiner asked Major Markov to let him in. The meeting got off to a rough start. Ansgar went on the offensive straight away. He asked Heiner if he was now satisfied since he'd pushed me past my limit, but Heiner didn't say a word in response. Ansgar, infuriated by his indifference, walked up to him and grabbed him by his shirt. His voice filled with rage as he demanded an explanation. An admission. Just something that made it obvious that Heiner was guilty of all his crimes. Ansgar held Heiner up against the door, challenging everything he'd ever believed in, everything he'd ever done. He really hoped to make Heiner feel guilty for it all. But no one gets Heiner to do anything. Only Heiner has that power. He easily shoved Ansgar away from himself and put some distance between them before demanding to know why he was in his house. Ansgar was blunt with his answer. He'd come because he couldn't trust Heiner with my life. No sugarcoating it. Heiner asked if he planned to take me to Franz on a platter for his restoration forces. Ansgar seemed to think that was the only logical thing to do. I was a risk to Heiner as it was. But Heiner wasn't dumb. The restoration forces wanted me for my royal blood. I was all that was left of the old nobles, capable of reproducing more royal blood. I could make royal descendants. If only everyone knew I was infertile. I was pretty useless to the restoration forces as well. For a moment, Heiner contemplated telling Ansgar the truth just to see his reaction. But he didn't. He simply stated that giving me up was out of the question for him. Ansgar was furious. At Heiner, for hardening his heart. Angry that Heiner still wasn't done making my life terrible. But Heiner had other thoughts. I couldn't leave because I was more than just a victim. I was his reason, his result. Ansgar vowed to help me get the divorce. There was enough lawful reason now to win the case, but Heiner wasn't even fazed by that threat. Ansgar dared him to put his reputation on the line and promised to take up the matter in court. Heiner simply asked him a question that got him to stop dead in his tracks like a thief caught right in the act. Was he going to marry me because he still loved me? Ansgar asked him why he cared, and Heiner replied that he only wondered if I'd be happier with him in Franz. Ansgar couldn't answer his question, but he was pretty certain I'd not be unhappy enough to desire death. With Ansgar gone, life went back to normal. The new normal, for Heiner. Life had to continue even without me anyway. Major Markov brought in some urgent paperwork for him to take care of, and the man was full of so much religious eye service, blaming me for everything going on with Heiner. He blamed me for the reporters, for the headlines, for the stories flying around about Heiner as a result. And Heiner had just about enough of it. He stopped the man from saying more and confirmed that I'd really tried to die. Not for a pity party. I couldn't have gotten that either way. I'd try to die simply because of him, because of my husband, because of Heiner. I was moved to the annex for intensive care, so my room was pretty empty. Heiner had never seen the room empty before. And now, with everything that's happened, Heiner couldn't help but admit that there had been signs the whole time. Signs he'd ignored. He searched everywhere in the room. Corners, drawers, and he found the pouch. The same one where I'd kept all the shells I gathered on the beach that day. The very first time I'd fancied what lay beyond this side of life. He was surprised. He'd disposed of them back at the hotel that night, and yet, somehow, here they were, gathered inside a pouch in my bedroom. He was genuinely curious. What was my motive? The scenes flashed through his mind. My conversation with the lady back on the train. But this was all the information he had. There had to be something he was missing. Right? He searched around further and found the vault that served as my jewelry box, and the donation logs for the Padania Civilian Association. He'd assumed I'd dropped the responsibility after the revolution because no one would have acknowledged my contributions anyway. He just wanted to know why. And the answer soon found him. Inside the fancy box sitting in the vault was the ring he'd asked me about back at the hospital. The one that had bound me to him for years. He finally understood. I'd planned everything down to the letter, and it broke him. He looked down at his own hand. His ring was still wrapped around his finger. He'd never taken it off, even when he held so much hatred for me. Heiner was, for the first time, confused, clueless. My sins hadn't been wiped away just yet. No, I doubt he ever thought they would. In fact, Heiner vowed to hate me for the rest of his life and continue seeking his revenge. But deep down in his heart, Heiner wished I'd wake up. So he'll take me to all the places I'd always wanted to go, like Glenford. He clenched the ring in his fist and poured every bit of his will into the words, "Stay by my side." I lay still on the bed in the annex, completely oblivious to everything else wrong with the world, to Heiner's wary prescience by my bedside. All I could hear was the piano, in my head, notes, lots of them, swimming through my subconscious state, slow, heavy tones, and they felt familiar, like the sound of life. My eyes fluttered open, and I heard the mix of panic and relief in Heiner's voice as he called out to me. My eyes widened in horror as I realized one gnawing truth. I hadn't died after all. Dr. Lauren arrived at the scene almost instantly. I was husk of tears. The tears were filled with anger and frustration. Why couldn't I get pitied just once in my life? Even by death? Dr. Lauren checked my vitals and recommended that Heiner leave me alone to get some more rest. He agreed a little reluctantly and ended up at the foot of the door outside the room. He'd seen it in my eyes, the disappointment. The fact that I'd have rather died than get used to the pain he fed to me daily. But he had so much to say to me. And at the same time, he had no idea what to say. Not when I was despairing at having survived. I lay on my bed, my eyes heavy with tears, my heart equally full of despair and disappointment. Why did I survive? Why? Was it because I was weak, like Heiner had said? Because I couldn't even be good at dying? Because I'd had things done for me my whole life? But I could have died if only they'd left me alone. Why did they interfere? I was doing just okay. I called out to the maid who was dozing off in the corner and asked her to give me some privacy. But she'd been given orders to stay and not leave me alone. I tried to assure her I was okay, but she insisted on getting my guardian. I tried to tell her it was unnecessary, and just as she was trying to convince me that it was, Heiner himself barbed into the room. I looked away, intent on ignoring him. He asked how I felt. I didn't give him an answer. He explained that I couldn't be left alone because I was still unstable. I bluntly asked if he'd been the one who saved me. When he said that he was, I couldn't help but ask why. I'd reached the point he wanted me to. I was unhappy enough to die. I'd given him everything he wanted. Right? But he had to show up and ruin it. This seemed to get Heiner angry. He was confused. Did I really expect him to let me die? Of course I did. No sweet talking around it. Heiner stated that he'd never wished to push me to my death. But I confronted him with the big question. Had it never crossed his mind? If he was being honest. All the while he'd been wishing me the worst, didn't he know death was also an option on that list? He'd never even seen me as a human being. Imagine that. What was worse than that? Heiner was stunned into silence. He stuttered an admission that was so honest it felt like a lie coming from him. He didn't want me to die. By the next day, I moved back to my room. It was then that I learned of Ansgar's visits and his notes. Ansgar. I wished I could help him see the truth. We were never going to be the same again. Why couldn't he leave the past in the past? As if reading his notes had summoned him, Ansgar knocked on my door and I asked him to come in. I tried to make small talk about the weather just so he could lose some of the tension in his face. He asked about my health and was pleased to learn that I was much better. Then an awkward silence traveled between us momentarily before Ansgar broke it. He stated that I could have confided in him. I apologized. I wasn't saying it to be nice anyway because he was my friend. No, I knew he wanted to take me with him to France. And of course, he didn't take long before bringing it up. Again. He promised not to talk about the incident or blame me for my actions. All he wanted was for me to stop suffering and embrace a new life with him in France. It was the best option after all. I decided to tell him the truth. The real truth. I was barren, infertile. I was useless to his cause, to the restoration forces. Ansgar was dumbfounded. He couldn't believe his ears. And then, he finally admitted to being sent by the restoration forces, for the royal bloodline she carried. But that didn't mean he was going to leave her in Pandania. I was a little confused. What use was I to him? Ansgar admitted that his feelings for me had never really left. But that me, the me that was special, important, that me was long gone. All the things that made me the me he'd fallen in love with, they were all history. I had nothing to offer, but Ansgar didn't mind. All that mattered was his love for me. I found it a little laughable. What use was his love if he couldn't marry me? But after a moment of hesitation, Ansgar said he was open to getting married to me, but not right away. He'd just gotten divorced and I had to go through with mine. What was important was that he'd get my word that I'd go with him to France. On his way out of the house, Ansgar bumped into Heiner. Heiner expressly told him to stop visiting. Brazen, right? Even Ansgar was angry that Heiner could make such a request. But he had every right to. He was my husband after all. For some funny reason, Ansgar was certain I'll divorce Heiner and run off with him to France. Heiner casually taunted him with a simple question, if I'd agreed. Ansgar seemed pretty confident I'd take him up on his offer this time. Rather that than spend the rest of my life by Heiner's side. Heiner let out an irritated sigh and broke the news about my infertility to him. But this was no news anymore. Heiner was, well, surprised. Ansgar was angry that he'd assumed he'd just leave me alone simply because I couldn't have children to continue the royal bloodline. Heiner was more interested in learning how he'd found out. Ansgar used the opportunity to brag about how he knew me better than Heiner would ever do. It'd take more than infertility nonsense to sabotage our relationship. Heiner was amused by how ridiculously confident Ansgar was. It was ridiculous that he'd assumed he'd win a battle against him with just a few visits after 3 years. Heiner closed the distance between them and used his imposing figure to intimidate Ansgar as he stated a fact. I could never leave him. He'd never allow it. Ansgar was too intimidated to make any other coherent points. Heiner didn't need him to. He ordered him out of the house with immediate effect. Even moments after he'd left, Ansgar was still reeling with fear from the interaction with Heiner. The man had sounded like a wounded lion, doing everything possible to keep what power it had left, to establish authority. His words seemed more like a note to himself than anything else. A vow, an oath. Meanwhile, back in my room, I couldn't help but worry about my hands. They were always cold. I recalled my conversation with Ansgar from earlier in the day. Even though he'd said he didn't mind, I knew he was only trying to do me a favor. There was absolutely nothing he stood to gain by marrying me. At best, I'd be his perfect plaything. Nothing more. But did I deserve anything more at this point? What other options did I even really have? Heiner broke through my thoughts with a knock on the door, followed by his towering presence by my bedside. He wanted us to take a walk in the garden, to give me a change of environment. I did as told, without a shred of resistance left to offer. He put a shawl over my shoulder when I came up to him. "It's old outside," he said. We walked together in silence for a while before he finally asked if the wind wasn't too much for me. I brushed off his concerns for me, but he persisted and handed me his gloves. Did I have a choice? He'd probably force them on me anyway. He glanced down at me as if he'd sensed my thoughts and said I didn't have to wear the gloves if they made me uncomfortable. But again, I brushed off his concerns. Then out of the blue, he asked if I wanted to go anywhere special. Anywhere at all that I wished to go. But I answered and said no. He brought up the beach and spoke about the Sunset Cliffs somewhere a little past Glenford. I'd always wanted to go back to a beach we'd been to in Santiago, but he'd never been willing to let me. So, the idea died a natural death in my mind. Why was he making me all these offers out of nowhere? Heiner called my attention once he realized I'd not acknowledged any of his suggestions. I only agree with him because I didn't have any energy to do otherwise. I saw the relief on his face once I agreed, but he'd never have seen what came next. I had a comb with sharpened tips in my room by the next day, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back for Heiner. He sentenced me to time with a therapist. Of course I didn't want any of it, but I was tired of refusing it anyway. Heiner tried to talk with me more, even though my responses were shorter and less forthcoming. I never spoke about the divorce again or complained about feeling unwell. All I did was just nod. Yes, nod in agreement. Just well enough to convince Heiner that I didn't need the attention he was throwing my way. And he seemed to buy it. Only skeptically, though, because he could never really shake off the feeling that I'd try and take my life again. It was soon another festive season in Rochester. The whole town was gathering snow pretty fast. I loved the snow. Heiner knew this, and he figured it'd be a nice reason to get me interested in leaving the house. He also got me a gift. He didn't give it to me right away, but instead decided to surprise me with it. He walked up to my door and knocked gently the first time. No response. Panic instantly set in. The door was locked. Luckily, a maid came around and explained that she'd only locked it because she had to step out to get some water. But that only meant one thing. I'd been left by myself inside the room. Heiner quickly put his shoulder to work, ramming into the door until it gave way. His eyes widened in horror at the sight waiting for him. I was hanging down from a rope in the middle of the room. My story was well on its way to the end. Finally, I'd concluded a little too soon. Heiner jumped to my side and cut me down, cradling me in his arms as we landed on the floor in a heap. With horror in his eyes, he searched my face to be sure I was still breathing. I gasped for breath, tears rolling down my eyes like a leaking dam. Heiner held me by my shoulders and shook me, asking what I'd hoped to achieve. He still couldn't understand why I was bent on dying. He'd had enough. He wanted it to stop. He begged for it to stop. He'd do anything I wanted. But my mind was made up, my words barely carrying above a whisper as I confessed to being tired of it all. I wanted to die. It's always hard to admit that no one truly has power over another's life. They make the decision whether or not to live, or die. It took Heiner so long to finally admit this with me, but he couldn't simply admit defeat. No, not when he could control things. Or at least try hard to. He considered locking me up in a place where I couldn't harm myself, preserving my brutally battered body. But didn't that make him the lunatic? The sick one with a mental condition? Finally, he looked down at me and asked me with all sincerity what I truly wanted. The divorce. Ansgar and his invitation to Franz. He was willing to let it all happen. He was willing to give me the end I wanted. Not the one he wanted. He was ready to let me go. If only it meant that I'd not try taking my life again. But what did it matter anyway? It was too late already. Everything was now empty, meaningless. Heiner tried to make me promise I'd live if he gave me the divorce. I nodded in agreement. By morning of the following day, I was seated at a table with my lawyer, finalizing the details of my divorce. Once everything was put in place, I put my signature down on the papers. Heiner had been nice enough to offer me hospitality for as long as I wished, even though we were no longer married. Heiner was now my ex-husband, but I declined his offer and rose to take my leave. On my way out, I bumped into him, and he sounded sad that I didn't take him up on his offer. But he didn't try to stop me. He was done doing that to me. He pressed a gift into my hand, beautiful hairpin, and made me promise not to stop living. With that, he wished me a happy holiday and let me be on my way. And so everything just happened. I dreamed of this moment, my freedom from Heiner Waldemar, but it had all happened in such a flash, and it didn't quite feel like I'd imagined. It felt like nothing. His bounce replayed in my mind. The promise I'd made him. To live. But what did I have to live for? Death wasn't such a bad option, right? Because surely whatever life had in store for me after the divorce had to be worse. I could feel it in my gut. Heiner's gift felt warm and alive in my palm. What was next? The hairpin didn't have the answer to my quest. It surely didn't know what death suited me best now. While I was still in thought, a looking shadow blocked out the light of the sun, instantly catching my attention. Meanwhile, Heiner had watched me leave the mansion from his window. Heiner. Things had always been hard to read with him, even right from the beginning. It had all started from unrequited love. One that I couldn't give to him because I'd had no idea who he was at the time. I'd certainly not known he became loyal to my father just to get to me. No, I didn't know. The class difference was always distinct, as clear as night and day. This had formed the foundation of Heiner's struggle. This had given him reason to cheat and take lives, just so he could have me. But now I'd pulled the rug from underneath his feet. Just like that. Everything he'd endured and done, his bloodied hands, all of that was all in vain. But I couldn't have known about all these, right? After all, I was still a spoiled only daughter, oblivious to the world outside my fairy tale one. I wouldn't have known this was why he'd come to loathe me deeply. I was the reason he'd lost himself in the first place. His blood and sacrifice were the price for my happiness. I made him into a monster. But then, of course, I wouldn't have known. I'm mostly ignorant after all. right? I was responsible for everything. But what use is a crime that is unknown? So let's go ahead and make a long list of all the things I'd also missed. Heiner had gone off to the Sutherlane Island on confidential grounds for military training. He had to work his way up the ladder to meet my father and then me. And that came at a heavy price. You see, my father, the Marquis, was pretty hard to impress, so you'd only understand why Heiner knew he needed to put some extra effort. This didn't really sit well with the other recruits who only assumed he was trying to show off. They beat him for it. Heiner was bullied. Because of me. So, while I was back home in the Rozenberg mansion, running through the rose garden and playing away at my piano, 15-year-old Heiner Waldemar was getting his ass kicked by silly bullies for trying a little too hard to become someone worthy of my attention. Heiner was immersed into the gruesome program instantly. Everyone who'd ever heard about the secret training camp, and that was an almost non-existent number of people, knew without mincing words that it was a death sentence. He was thrown right into survival training, a rigorously dangerous exercise that meant just what its name implies: survive or die. To an outsider, trying to stay alive for just 3 hours while retrieving the name tags of other participants would seem like a walk in the park, right? That'd have worked in a tea party, because in this training program, there were no combat rules, and the participants had to get to the finish line at the designated time. Heiner was given a miserable jackknife for the exercise. He glanced over his shoulder at Ethan, his friend. They'd reached an agreement the previous night, not to act like they knew each other in the survival exercise, as well as not to betray each other. The supervisor gave the signal and the training sprang to life. All the participants made a quick dash for the woods up ahead to gain a position of advantage. That was the kind of life lived on the southern island, where the Royal Military had a secret training camp. Their intakes were mostly orphaned teenagers, who they trained to be spies and informants. No one ever questioned the supply of these intakes because, according to the royal family, they were doing the streets a favor by getting rid of them. Heiner was quick on his feet, hurling the knife in the air to take out an opponent before quickly retrieving their name tag and weapon. These orphans were just like him. He'd lost his parents pretty early in life, and by 12, he was an intake of the program. The chances of survival were slimmer than a knife's edge. 7 years of gruesome training with a 30% survival rate. How insane is that? Heiner had been so preoccupied with his thoughts that he nearly missed the pack of bullies waiting up ahead. The final years who'd been making life hell for him in the camp. He ducked behind a tree and weighed the options. The group suddenly began arguing among themselves, and Heiner weighed in on his chances to take them out. For good. He found even more reason to do so when the bullies bragged about eliminating Ethan. The boy had barely made it through the exercise before the group of bullies got to him. How sad. The bullies tried taunting Heiner into fear, pretty confident they could end him like they'd ended his friend. But you see? In truth, Heiner had never been a weakling. Very far from that. He just never really appreciated being in the spotlight, and that was all he'd get from winning all the challenges. But these bunch of misfits had pushed him one too many times, and he'd had just about enough. And what better opportunity could he ask for than the survival training program? Elsewhere, the supervisor and the head of the Special Operations Division, Dietrich Rozenberg, were having a conversation. The supervisor was excited by the improved standard of things at the camp, but Dietrich couldn't care less if they were terrible. He'd lost faith in the intakes even before they had the chance to prove their worth. He wanted just the barest minimum alive at the end of the program. The rest were just unnecessary mouths to feed, and he wanted none of those. This, in fact, was the sole purpose of the survival training. Heiner's set of trainees weren't exactly outstanding to the head of the Special Operations Division, except for a boy named Benjamin, who'd come visiting his mansion once in the past. Heiner wasn't even considered, until he was. The signal for the end of training was fired into the air, and the trainees began to spill out of the woods, bloodied and panting from the rigorous routine they'd managed to survive. Dietrich wasn't impressed by the looks of them, except Heiner. He was instantly interested once he saw him. At this time, Heiner was only a third year, but the supervisor sold him up to Dietrich, so it'd seem as though he was the best thing that had happened to the program. And Heiner proved his worth as well, because by the time the instructor saw the number of tags in his hands and heard the names of the people they'd belonged to, he instantly screamed for the supervisor's attention. Heiner Waldemar had killed the brightest student, Benjamin. Heiner was placed on bed rest and a handful of painkillers. Hugo was more than impressed that he'd finally gotten rid of the bullies from the graduating class with minimum injury as well. He was intrigued by Heiner's ability to pull it off, but their violence wasn't foreign to Heiner. He'd lived it out in his years in the orphanage. Hugo was curious to know if Heiner had done it to avenge Ethan's death, but that wasn't the case. It had just kind of happened. His friend was excited for him, as you'd naturally expect. This meant things were going to turn around for the better. Goodbye to the days of living in fear. He was now the picture of fear to everyone. An instructor interrupted their conversation. He asked how Heiner was feeling and told him he was now eligible to use the instructor's clinic. And this was a rare occurrence. But that wasn't all. Heiner had also been invited to a lunch banquet by the Marquis himself. He was going to the famed Rozenberg mansion. Hugo waited for the instructor to leave before breaking into a frenzy over what they'd just heard. As far as he was concerned, Heiner had hit the jackpot in life. This was an express invitation to join the Marquis' Special Operations Unit. Maybe not express, but still. He stood a better chance now. Heiner mulled over the words and thought about how Ethan would have been jealous if he'd heard the news. It had always been Ethan's dream to join the Marquis' special unit. It was all he ever talked about. Ethan tutted and asked when the new roommate would arrive. But Heiner didn't have the answer to that question. Here's a fact about the Pandanian royal family. They assigned special missions to agents from the training camp. We're talking missions that even the regular army couldn't handle? Yeah, those kinds of missions. But they also wanted the agents to remain undercover. The orphans from Sutherlane couldn't enlist in the regular army, but the Marquis' special unit was an exception. It was the lifelong dream of every single trainee. Heiner couldn't help but look around in awe at the paradise of a mansion. It looked unreal. Everything felt so heavenly. Even the dishes were foreign to Heiner. Luxury like the kind he was seeing simply didn't exist in the world he knew. He wasn't alone. There were other people invited to the mansion for the banquet as well. And then there was the ceiling painting. The Marquis quickly jumped in to brag about it. It was 200 years old. Even nobles were amazed by it, let alone commoners like the ones sitting at his table. Commoners like Heiner. While Marquis Dietrich continued to vaunt about the painting, Heiner stole quick glances at the image of the Saint Mary. He'd never quite seen anything as divine as it is. He'd never even believed in a divine existence. Until now. It made sense to him instantly. Why people believed in God. The next came the Rose Garden. One look at the paradise of a place, and Heiner knew Ethan would have loved it. The Marquis was whisked away by the supervisor for some important business, leaving Heiner and the other guests to enjoy the views. And they had quite some time before their carriage left for the training camp. Heiner prized the opportunity to get a better tour of the mansion, but he soon became tired. It had to be because of all the injuries he'd sustained from the survival training. He searched for the perfect place to rest and found a bench underneath this tree shade. Perfect. He just wanted to return to camp. But fate had other fun ideas. The wind carried a melody on its wings, dancing in the air around him until the fatigue completely vanished from his eyes. Heiner had no idea what song it was or who'd sung it, but it held a dear place in his heart, from a lifetime he'd known in the past. He began tracing the source of the music until he found an open window on the side of the mansion. The breeze danced through the curtains, making them sway in its wake. Heiner walked as quietly as possible, his eyes fixed on the source of the music. Of course, it was me. I was barely his age, sitting in front of that giant old grand piano and playing away my heart with joy. That was our first contact, although I never knew this. I never knew how he'd looked at me and saw the same divine beauty he'd seen wafting from the painting up in the ceiling in my father's house. I recall hearing a twig snag in the distance and looking up in alarm. But when I went to the window to see what had made the sound, he was long gone. Heiner ran through the maze of rose flowers in the garden like a man being chased by a wolf. I'd never known, but the piece I was playing on the piano was the first he'd ever heard. It had been a gift from the matron at the orphanage, a music box, this pretty small item that held the greatest value in his heart at the time. But even music was a luxury he couldn't have, not in the eyes of the orphanage bullies. They broke the box into pieces and taunted him. Back in the garden, with enough distance between him and my window, Heiner stopped to catch his breath and wondered what he'd actually been running away from. There was so much he'd wished he'd done differently. Take complimenting my performance, for instance. Everything eclipsed so perfectly well. The music box and me. And that became the eternal focus of his life. His reason to get out of the Sutherlane in one piece. The contrasts were clear. I was my father's only daughter, born into affluence from the beginning while he was a commoner, an orphan doomed to the woes of the Special Operations Division. There were no lines of similarities to draw between us. None at all. And the finality of this truth was a weight too heavy for Heiner Waldemar to bear. It slowly began seeping into his routine at the camp. He began slipping up in areas he'd usually excel in without breaking a sweat. Even worse, his old wound from survival training reopened. When Hugo asked him what the matter was, Heiner showed him the wound. Hugo asked his friend why he didn't go to the infirmary right away. Heiner wasn't sure why, but he was uninterested anyway. Hugo had this crazy idea to make a flute out of a reed. Yeah, even Heiner thought it was dumb too. But Hugo had enough practice doing it and put Heiner through the process as well. When he was done, he made Heiner blow into his newly made flute, and of course the sound was pretty horrible. Hugo offered to show him now it was done, and by the end, he had Heiner genuinely curious to learn how he'd made music out of an ordinary reed. Apparently, it was a skill Hugo had inherited from his father. Heiner looked down at the crude flute in his hand and wondered if he could play the same music he'd heard me playing, the same one from his boyhood days. But he didn't know how to. The flute just couldn't make the same piano sound he'd heard back at the Rozenberg mansion. Heiner longed to hear it again, longed to revisit the moment just once. The honors came pouring in when it was time for grading. Heiner snatched up basically every award that there was. His colleagues feared he was working a little too hard. But for Heiner, it was a worthy price to pay, if only to hear me play the piano again. He gave his all to the training, determined to come out tops, to become worthy of the class my family occupied. Heiner had no dreams. He had no real desire to succeed, not even a genuine wish. But anytime he came around the mansion and heard me play, it made everything else seem irrelevant, non-existent. The experience for him felt like an otherworldly affair, a journey to a world where only our hearts were entwined in happiness. Because of the rigorous training they received, a lot of trainees with the division were placed on mood stabilizers, Heiner inclusive. On one of those appointments to the doctor, she noticed he was different, more distant, as if focused on something only he could see. She implored him to go easy on himself because she could see him going down the same sad path she'd seen other trainees before him take in all her 12 years of experience. His aspiration could equally be poisonous to him. Later that day, the trainees were shocked to find the lady, bloodied and hanging from a tree by a noose she'd made with her own hands. Or so they'd been made to believe. Looking at her bloodied body, Heiner couldn't shake off the weight of her words, the last he'd heard from her. Things would inevitably get worse for him at the training camp. The next level for the trainees was a horrid exercise named the torture and survival training. Heiner's eyes were covered and his limbs were bound to a chair. Then came the horrible words from the instructor. He said such downgrading things to Heiner, the poor boy instantly began doubting the basis of his own existence. But Heiner had never asked to be born an orphan. No one ever asks for that. The Special Operations Department was wired to turn orphans, and People Society had tagged useless into tools that could be offered up in sacrifice for the greater good of the more noble class. The unfortunate trainees were the ones with dispensable lives, who would wage war and make sure the noble class, the elite, and all other royalty remain unchallenged. How cruel and unfair. Heiner survived the whole ordeal all right. But the one thing playing in his mind was the thought that if only he'd been born to a more noble family, then maybe, just maybe, everything would be different. And I'd have spoken to him without any hesitation, listened to his thoughts with a kind smile, like I would to any fellow noble. The picture was enough to make him drift away for a moment, out of the cell where he was being tortured as training, to a world where we were friends and I cared about him, where little things like playing the piano were important and he could make song requests like he was at a concert. That kind of world. It was a dream worth dying for. But who was he kidding? His head was still full with the voice of the instructor, and the words he said, such vile things that should never have been said to any human being. Heiner and the other orphans were lambs of sacrifice, whose lives were only worth the price to be paid for the peace of Pedania. Heiner would survive the torture and come over to the mansion again with the rest. And when he saw me through that same window, he envied me, the peace of my life, the fact that no one would inject strange drugs into me like they did with him. I would never have to endure the torture he had to. I might never even learn about the training camp in my lifetime. But he wondered for a moment if all of that would change if I learned of his existence. If I'd empathize with him and be kind to him for a change. It had to make sense. I played such a beautiful piece of music on the piano after all, didn't I? Heiner thought of me as sacred and noble, and he carried this mindset with him for the rest of his program at the camp, until he graduated, 4 years later. My father, the Marquis Dietrich Rosenberg, was the patron of the event on that day. It happened at the Rosenberg Mansion. The surviving graduates of the program were officially recognized and inducted into practice. Afterward came deployment, and with that, Heiner was going to be away for an indefinite period of time. For him, it was a call to prove his loyalty and competence, even at the cost of his life. All he had to do was show his competence with the Special Task Force unit, and he'd earn an automatic qualification to the regular army. Right? That'd mean he would be one step closer to my class in society. That'd mean he could approach me and let me know that there was a soul in the world named Heiner Waldemar. Heiner threw himself at challenge after challenge, proving to be one of my father's most reliable and trusted agents. And I found fortune with the international piano competition myself, so I made it to the front page of the newspapers. Heiner remained unknown to me for the better part of 5 years. And the next time he'd see me was in the summer of 1712, in my father's mansion. Rumors of my beauty had spread across the city, and most people looked up to me, on the pedestal that was my family's social class. At this time, the practice room had been moved to somewhere else inside the house. That was the beginning of the climb up another mountain of doubts for Heiner, because for the first time since he made his resolution, he questioned the essence of everything. The future seemed too far-fetched and unattainable for him. How would he stand a chance when he could barely see me except by luck? Heiner's friend Jackson soon caught the hint of his desire for me, and when Heiner tried brushing it off, he suggested Heiner take the chance and tell me how he felt. Heiner shut him off immediately. Jackson was disappointed by his blindness to the possibility of a union with me. Heiner stood a chance, especially with his good looks. Everyone knew how much I prioritized physical appearance. Besides, as my father's only daughter, I'd grown quite stubborn and would have no one interfering with my love life. While Jackson could see only the positives, Heiner was blinded by the many ways things couldn't work, the many obstacles that would always stop us from being together. He chose to think about the facts, the guys I met, the ones who were in my class, and he felt so oddly out of place trying to paint himself into the picture. Heiner was more than relieved to go back on assignment shortly after, to the life he felt more suited for. His unit was assigned a special mission somewhere in Franz Munich. The night cold was unforgiving as he and his comrades sat by a fire whining about how unfair the elements had been to them. But Heiner wasn't bothered. In fact, he kept on his most serious face through the whole exchange going between his comrades. They teased him, called him a spy for the enemy camp. Over-serious. A whole lot. He remained indifferent to their teasing, however friendly it seemed. There was one lady in their group, Anne, who had a lover back home. And for someone in their social bracket, that was quite unheard of. Hugo wondered why she even bothered when they couldn't get married. People like them weren't qualified for marriage in the laws of Pedania. Anne clapped back at him by saying she wasn't looking to take advice from someone who'd never been in a relationship before. Jackson didn't think relationships were anything more than a weakness to the operatives of the Special Forces. Anne stirred the conversation back to Heiner by asking if he had a secret lover like she did, and if he was going to cherish her. Heiner casually pointed out that whatever was precious to him was precious to others too, so cherishing a lover was pretty pointless. He'd eventually lose the lover anyway. But rather than fighting away the competition, Heiner reasoned he'd just destroy the lover in question, so she'd not be precious to others anymore. Anne immediately picked up the psychopathic undernote in his words, but Hugo thought Heiner was right to be out of his mind, especially since they were all stuck in the island. While his comrades fell back into their conversation, Heiner couldn't help but wonder if he truly was broken and in need of fixing. Thinking about me made him feel that way. Miserable. For him, his love and affection was unrequited, like pouring water on stone. I barely even knew he existed. So the more he idolized me in his heart, the more miserable his life became. He regretted ever meeting me. Unfortunately for Heiner and his team, their mission failed. The Special Operations team was infiltrated by a traitor, and their location was compromised. Almost all the members were captured. Jackson managed to escape, and it was left to the others to hold on patiently until he could get reinforcements. Their captors were brutal. Heiner had gotten some practice with the torture training during his camp days, but even with that, it was difficult to endure the beatings, the inhumane torture he and the others received at the hands of their captors. But he had to endure. He had to endure if he was going to see Pedania again, if he was going to see me again. It became his mantra. Heiner was ultimately dragged into a cell for interrogation. The interrogator spoke in Franz, the language of the enemy. But Heiner understood quite well. He was the last one to be interrogated by the enemy. and the only one who hadn't said anything. Yet. That's what the interrogator led him to believe. But Heiner, always the smart one, read between his lies and strengthened his resolve. He wasn't giving the enemy what they needed. But once Marquis Dietrich's name was mentioned, Heiner wondered for a second if one of his comrades had actually said anything. Or perhaps it was the work of the traitor who'd gotten them in the whole mess to begin with. His interrogator jerked him up by his hair and demanded for any information in exchange for his life. Now, that was a tempting offer. The man's logic was simple. Get Heiner to pretend he'd told everything to the enemy and convince his comrades to do the same, except that he'd not really said anything. Heiner had strong faith in Jackson. The Marcus was either going to arrange for a prisoner exchange or send reinforcements. Seeing he wasn't giving in, the interrogator left him for a while to go and speak with his comrades. Heiner was dragged back to his cell in chains. Days passed and he was dragged off to a cell where Hugo was sitting. The pair were under the watchful eyes of 2 enemy guards. Heiner's eyes went wide in shock at the sight of his friend. Hugo looked terrible. But he didn't look any better. Only a heartbeat later, Hugo suggested they give the enemy what they wanted. The truth. Heiner wasn't convinced. Hugo was even more convinced that they weren't making it out of captivity alive. So what was the point of holding back to another man's secrets? Heiner tried to straighten his friend out, to remind him that they'd seen even worse forms of torture back at the training camp on Sutherlane. But Hugo dropped a bombshell that sort of made him swallow his words momentarily. Jackson was the traitor. Heiner paused. The interrogator had revealed this to Hugo, and in retrospect, it all made sense. I mean, why else would he be the only one to escape? It made sense to Heiner. He'd suspected it at some point. He'd just been in denial. But Hugo was still confused. They'd known Jackson well down to his roots. The lad was from Sutherlane, the island where the Special Forces camp was located. Had he always been a traitor? Was he born and brainwashed in France first before being sent down to Sutherlane? What did it all matter anyway? He was responsible for everything, all their troubles, born traitor or trained traitor. He was a traitor, and Hugo wished more than anything for a chance to kill him quickly. They fell into a wave of silence before Hugo began speaking again. He credited his survival to Heiner, from the point of the training program to the present moment. He'd learned a lot from watching Heiner. While he was still speaking, the guards jerked him up by his arms and hauled him out of the room. Several days passed. Heiner was locked away in solitude, his body hanging by his arms, fastened to the wall by chains. He still hadn't given in, and the interrogator was losing his patience. The other members of Heiner's team gave him some information quite all right, but the catch was that they were saying too many different things all at once. 2 of them were already dead, and so were their accounts of the information they'd given. But Heiner, whatever he was going to say would be the final piece of the puzzle. The interrogator still couldn't understand Heiner's stubbornness when it was clearly at the expense of his own life. But Heiner, he did want to live. He wanted to live so badly, he was so sure he'd make it out of captivity. He burst into hysterical laughter, and the interrogator didn't find it funny one bit. Heiner kept goading him to anger with his snide remarks. He'd figured that even if he disclosed classified information, he'd be eliminated by the Marquis himself upon returning to Pedania. But if only he could endure and keep his mouth shut. He spat at the interrogator's feet in defiance, and that was the last straw that broke the camel's back for him. Heiner mocked their interrogation skills with confidence. He was going to return home. It was only a matter of time. So he wasn't going to say a word to the enemy. I remained at the center of the picture for him, the prize at the end of all the suffering. The infuriated interrogator picked up a baton and whipped him hard with it, hard enough to make Heiner wonder if he'd broken all the bones in his body. He didn't stop there. He took the torture up a notch, and it hurt Heiner so much. But the promise of the end, it was too good to let go of just yet. Heiner fancied giving up and just dying after everything, but he held on to the hope of returning to meet me. The interrogator ripped off Heiner's shirt, his hand turning a metal rod in hot flames just inches away. Without warning, he picked up the hot metal and pressed it hard against Heiner's chest. The iron walls of the cells rang with the sound of Heiner's screams. But did he give up? No. It was all worth it. For the chance of earning a place in the higher social class, so he could stand in front of me and call my name. Heiner was a thing of wonder to the enemy. He looked worse than death, but he still wasn't ready to talk. Heiner's body felt like it was set on fire and then crushed under a rolling pin. But he fought the darkness, the one that threatened to pull him underneath like the miserly blanket the enemy had spared him. He had to return to Pedania, to me. Of course, I had no idea what struggles he was facing at the time. The torture, the beatings, the inhumane treatment he was receiving in the name of the kingdom. I was probably playing my music on the piano. Somewhere within the protection of the mansion, the only feeling of sadness I'd feel would probably be for getting a below-perfect performance. Thinking in retrospect now, that must have looked so trivial and inconsequential compared to what he had to go through. But he knew none of it was my fault. I was born into the life I had. It only made sense that I only knew what I was allowed to. Heiner strongly believed I'd be angry, see things through his eyes with a righteous age, if only I could learn about the least of his sufferings. He thought me to be as pure as the music I played on the piano. Time passed and seasons changed in the prisons of Franz. The people of the colonies in Lapland declared war on Franz. They'd taken enough and wanted their independence. They attacked the prisons and most of the inmates escaped. Only a few agents from Marquis Dietrich's special force remained, but they were in a state worse than death and had to be ultimately eliminated. They were a weakness that had to be culled from the rest of the force. Heiner and Anne made it past their executioners, but somewhere in the middle of their escape, he turned around on her, holding a gun up to shoot. He'd had his suspicions all along, but he wanted to confirm them first. Anne confessed to being the weak link, the one who ratted the secrets of the special force to the enemy. Heiner wasted no time in delivering her sentence. One fatal shot straight to her chest, sending a shower of blood into the air around them. But Anne had said one crucial truth. All traitors were worthy of death. He wasn't a traitor, but he was part of the group that betrayed the mission. That made him just as guilty, didn't it? A flurry of questions began to run through Heiner's mind. The homeland they'd all been willing to die for. Whose was it? Theirs? Or the nobles whose lives were valued above theirs? Was Pedania even their homeland? Was any of what they'd seen at the hands of the enemy even right to begin with? Heiner's head felt bursting full with these questions, and he let out a roar of frustration. All he really wanted was to live, to return alive. No one else mattered. They were all dead. And all he had was the one thing that was precious to him, me. In the spring of 714, Heiner Waldemar returned to Pedania as a celebrated hero. My father, the Marquis Dietrich Rozenberg, cheered for him like a proud father. But this Heiner that had returned was nothing like the young boy who'd looked up at the ceiling painting in awe at his first invitation to the Rozenberg mansion. Nothing like the boy who'd endured years of gruesome abuse at the hands of the enemy. For a country that deemed him surplus to requirements, fit only to be led like a lamb to the slaughter. He was nothing like that. Not anymore. The ceremony felt like a sham to him, a well-organized trick to mask the callousness of the noble of Pedania. Marquis Dietrich congratulated him on his promotion. He'd finally earned his place in the upper class of the society, a proper army officer now. But it held no weight to Heiner. Dietrich praised him for returning to Pedania with the secrets of the enemy after what was feared to be a failed mission. Because of Heiner's bravery, he was certainly never going to lose his place in the king's court. And for that, he promoted Heiner to the rank of lieutenant in the army. Heiner played the part quite well, the grateful underdog who'd been favored by the Marquis. And Marquis Dietrich continued to milk the praises, saying how he'd never doubted Heiner's great destiny from the start. He recalled the incident with the 4 seniors from the graduating class, the bullies who'd made life unbearable for Heiner. He seemed pretty certain Heiner had taken them out because of his rift with them, but Heiner said otherwise. Dietrich had been paying attention the entire time. He'd noticed Heiner was a man of very few words, an almost antisocial fellow. And after questioning Heiner's relationship with his comrades back on the field, he confirmed his thoughts. Heiner was rather detached from other people. But he didn't think it was a flaw. Instead, he encouraged Heiner to remain that way, for the sake of his journey to the top. Dietrich expressed his grief at the news of the death of Heiner's comrades, but he ended with some high praise for Heiner's resilience, his willpower. He revealed that someone from the lower ranks had suggested a prisoner exchange, but he'd waved it off as unnecessary. For Marquis Dietrich, the lives of his agents were pretty dispensable. As much as he detested the Franz bastards, he thought it glorious that the agents had died for their country. They'd have died anyway, on the streets, as nobodies. Heiner was forced to swallow the poison in the older man's words, but deep in his mind, he loathed him for it. How dare he, from the comfort of his well-guarded mansion, assume he had the right to decide whose death was noble and whose wasn't? The trauma of being held captive lived rent-free in his mind, and the Marquis simply assumed a silly promotion in ranks was enough to make up for everything the struggle had eaten away from him? The Marquis had seen them all as collateral damage, prosperity of his not worth saving by any means. The sacrifices, the torture, the loyal service to the kingdom. It was all futile because they were all liabilities, abandoned right from the start. Like dust, the names of all of Heiner's comrades who'd given their lives for the kingdom crumbled away, forgotten without the courtesy of tiny tombstones at least. But in the eyes of the Marquis, the mission had been a success. Because of the deaths and the blood and the trauma living in Heiner's head, the Marquis had gained unassailable power. The end had finally come, but at what cost? What had become of Heiner's life after everything? Heiner found his way through the rose garden, snaking through the maze of flowers in a direction that led deeper into the mansion, to the window of the practice room which was now empty. And there and then, Heiner questioned it all. Why'd he come back at all? What did he hope to do when we eventually really met? What did he plan to say? He felt like a skeleton of himself, a shadow of the boy who'd fallen in love with the beautiful soul of the Marquis's daughter. Now he'd finally made it back, earned his way back to the same spot where it had all started. And it's all been futile. Heiner turned around in disappointment, already counting his loss as foolishness, when fate played a card into his hand. There I was, walking in his direction, my head bowed to the ground under the shade of my umbrella, until I looked up at his towering figure. He looked pale. I was instantly concerned for him and tried to find out if he was all right. But he remained silent, looking at me like he'd seen a ghost in clothes of swaddling light. I searched his eyes and figured he probably wasn't feeling well. When I offered to send for help, he assured me he was fine and said something silly about how he'd only been thinking. For that long? I was embarrassed and quickly began retreating, afraid that I'd disturbed him. But Heiner assured me I hadn't done anything wrong and I was instantly relieved. I took one glance at him and recognized the uniform of the army right away. Then Heiner asked the strangest question, if I knew him. But I'd only guessed he was in the army because of the uniform, and nothing more. Heiner nodded, his face reddening in embarrassment. I could see the awkwardness in his body language, the battle for the right words to say on his lips. And then suddenly he blurted out, well, everything. All of it. How he'd been abroad for a while on a secret mission, and how he'd earned a promotion. How he'd visited the mansion many times in the past, but hadn't quite introduced himself even though he really liked me. I spotted my father beyond the walls of roses in the distance and called out to him. Maybe that might have come off as snobbish at the time, but I was only so excited to see my father, and even more eager to quiz him about his drinking habits. My father led me back to Heiner and initiated a proper introduction. Heiner kept still the whole time until it was his turn to bow and acknowledge my father's introduction. And I thought he was too young to be a lieutenant in the Royal Army. That was the biggest achievement I'd ever heard of. My father sang his praises to my face, but I'd already heard my own fair share of the lone soldier who'd returned from a dangerous operation in the enemy territory, far away Franz Munich. It was my turn to be in awe. My father had told me so much about Heiner, but for someone who was so celebrated and gushed about, Heiner's eyes held a sadness that didn't feel redeemable, especially when he spoke about his fallen comrades. I expressed my condolences for their deaths, but I apparently moved on a little too quickly from the subject and asked after Heiner's inauguration ceremony. That was probably the moment he realized that I wasn't so different from my father after all. While I easily moved on to the future, already looking forward to another meeting with Heiner, he remained in shock. I'd just taken the lives of his comrades for granted, downplayed their sacrifice like it was nothing. I'd merely expressed grief in the passing way one would do for the death of a friend's old cat. Heiner questioned everything he'd ever believed about me. He questioned my piety, my kindness, my gift of soulful music on the piano. He'd been wrong all along, and he loathed himself for it. He was disappointed, sorely disappointed. He'd been delusional the entire time. He'd hoped I was different from my father, filled with the empathy he lacked and a righteous anger at injustice. He'd imagined that his pain, his life, the sufferings of both him and his comrades would be treated with more regard. But no, I was just like my father, oblivious to the horror of life outside my father's mansion, and to think they'd all suffered for people as callous as I and my father. Right there in that moment, filled with the rage of his realization, Heiner vowed to make me pay for the sins of my father and all like him. Heiner's rebellion didn't start overnight. It came with meticulous planning and preparation. He'd managed to lay his hands on some classified documents. There was a growing group of revolutionaries in the belly of the kingdom. They'd even formed an army. Normally, he'd have let my father know right away, but Heiner reconsidered his actions. My father, Marquis Dietrich Rosenberg, was going down. He wrote back to the sender of the letter he'd intercepted from the revolutionary group, offering information on both the Padania army as well as confidential details regarding my family. He hoped my family would have as much bitterness in our hearts as he did, that we'd lose as much as he had. And he hoped to be a figure in our darkest moments, just as we'd been in his. Heiner said it like a prayer, that the darkness that had engulfed his life would consume ours too. We had to be held accountable for everything. I had to, because I was the reason he'd endured it all, the reason he'd damned himself to the worst. Heiner's appointment ceremony took place. He'd earned himself a place in my father's trusted confidants. He was the shining star of the Padanian army. The orphan boy had died and was now reborn, a member of the high class. But despite the resentment Heiner felt for me, he still felt unworthy of my attention. Not to brag, but everyone knew me. Annette Rozenberg. I was both the fairest and most dignified woman in the capital of Padania. I wouldn't have to bat an eyelid if I wanted a man. Heiner knew this as well. He assumed I'd dated many men on a fling, just for the fun of it. And as far as Heiner was concerned, he could easily be one of those men that I dated just for the fun of it, only to end things once I got bored. But Heiner was confident that he could be the only exception. From our first meeting, he could tell right away that I'd taken a liking to him. And that was the birth of his plan. The plan that became the story of my life in later years. He started showing up more often, at my piano recitals, at the house for one of my father's many banquets, fashioning himself into the picture of my ideal man. Then came the first time Heiner Waldemar ever asked me out on a date. His plan was clear and simple from the onset. Get into my head, make me fall in love with him so that I could never recover from it. And oh, Heiner Waldemar was the most attentive man. He knew everything I loved, down to what books I read and what could intrigue me. He did his research. He was nothing like the other military men I'd met, and nearly half the men I'd ever met in my life were in the military. And they shared the same views about literature. It was a channel of pessimism. But Heiner seemed to think differently. In fact, he reasoned just like a writer would, and when I pressed him for the truth, he admitted to being one. I would never have known he'd done his homework on the men I'd been with in the past, why I fell for them and why I broke up with them. To say the least, Heiner learned everything there was to know about me. He built himself into the image of my perfect man. I should have seen through it all. It all seemed too perfect. Always affectionate, a good listener, a hopeless romantic with a good sense of style and fashion. A real man who knew how to take care of himself. I cluelessly soaked up all the attention he offered so freely, the opposite of the violence he kept locked up in his consciousness. Even the devil wears the perfect disguise when he wishes to destroy a soul. I was the unfortunate one this time around. On one of our outings, somewhere under the shade of a tree, I noticed Heiner was a little too absent-minded, unlike himself. When I tried to find out what the problem was, he apologized and brushed it off as the effects of a lack of sleep. Work was becoming increasingly demanding for him. I was moved in my heart and offered for us to reschedule our meeting. But Heiner, ever the perfect gentleman, he waved off my concerns and insisted on staying. I was the prize after all. And silly me, infatuated by this young soldier who'd become the poster boy of the Royal Army, asked Heiner why he hadn't asked to court me. Just like that, without second-guessing or trying to be proper. Heiner was stunned by the brazenness of my question. But I had my own concerns, and the suddenness of my question was the least on the list. We'd been seeing each other for a few months already, but he was yet to make it official. I quickly hit him with the confrontation card and asked if he really liked me. But Heiner quickly reassured me that he was putting in the effort because he really actually did like me. But that wasn't exactly a reason. I pressed him even further for one, and he finally worked up the courage to say the truth. The real reason why he'd yet to make us official. And it wasn't far from anything I'd have expected. Heiner still didn't think himself worthy of me. My life had to have been too figured out by my father to make room for a commoner like him. And when he expressed his fear of rejection, his face looking so forlornly and dejected, like I'd actually said I was going to reject him for sport, I felt sad in my heart. I asked him why he'd ever think I'd turn him down. Heiner tried to wave it off as his own insecurity, but a matter that important couldn't be swept under the rug. Not with me. Maybe somewhere between my choice of words, I admitted I liked him, and it ate me up that he was afraid of rejection. Heiner picked this up right away and turned to look at me. My cheeks heated up in a blush, but I tried to recover immediately. I shrugged it off with a playful smile as a joke because he'd been so serious. But even with all that, I trusted Heiner with my heart. So I took the initiative and asked Heiner Waldemar out first. He looked utterly stunned. I laughed at his reaction and asked if I'd been too forward. I would never have known Heiner had played me right into his trap, right into where he'd wanted me the whole time. Of course I'd never have known. He kept silent, and I pressed him for a response. He hadn't officially accepted or rejected my proposal. What surprised him the most was the confidence I had that he would definitely reciprocate the feelings I had for him, simply because it was just all I knew about life. Love and be loved. No questions asked. No hesitation. But for Heiner, who'd grown up on so much hostility and rejection, he saw himself as yet another replaceable item in my confession of love. For every time I said, "I like you, Heiner," he heard me saying, "I like jewelry," or "I like my purse." Something as equally trivial as physical possessions. And when I leaned into him, his breath caught, and he shyly admitted he felt the same way for me. But I wouldn't have known or understood why, Espicazled at that time, why he'd ever doubt my words, why he'd assumed he was just another good thing in my life, as ordinary as a piece of jewelry or something like that, something I could choose to like or dislike at any moment. I remember I teased him about what we'd tell people when we recounted the story of our courtship. We'd definitely hesitate to tell them I'd made the first move as the lady. Really, what was the big deal in that? I jokingly withdrew my proposal, and Heiner pulled me in close to himself, his face merely inches from mine as he made the proposal, our official first move for the record. In 716, Heiner got married in one of the largest cathedrals in Rochester. It was the proper military ceremony. Dignitaries and high-ranking names in the kingdom were present to honor my father's invitation. For Heiner, I probably meant more to him than he assumed he did to me, because I was all that mattered to him. Try as hard as his rebellious heart wanted, he just couldn't bring himself to really hate me. We said our vows before the priest and the congregation and were joined together for a life of bliss and happily ever after. Or so I thought. Heiner had merely made his first big step to actualizing his plan of vengeance. His plan to destroy me and take away everything I held dear to my heart, everything that made the world wonderful and happy to me. And of course, I said the vows like an enchanted fool, totally oblivious to the danger lurking ahead. To Heiner's personal vow to drag me into the darkest depths of life, into the shadows of the cruel world beyond the one I knew. And he hoped that by the time he was done, I'd be undesirable to everyone, including him. Heiner still felt unworthy of my love, and it was natural for him to make sure no one else ever replaced him. I was his precious thing. Remember? The chain of events leading to the worst moment of my life has already been set in motion. The rebellion was discovered, and my father turned a blind eye on my choice of suitor because it seemed like the most diplomatic thing to do. Royalty to commoner equals peace between both classes. Right? Wrong. Then there was another quelled rebellion attempt, followed by an even more vicious one that eventually succeeded and spelled the end of the government as we'd all known it. Heiner became commander-in-chief and let the world know the secrets of Sutherlane Island were revealed to the world. The monarchy was abolished, and my life with Heiner came to an end. Looking back, the events of my life seem pretty much short and straight to the point. But don't be fooled by the details hidden between the lines. If you pay attention to them, then you'll understand the truth. The whole truth. Meanwhile, time had passed, and it did its worst to me. I moved in with Catherine and was now helping out with things at the fruit store. She'd stepped out to get something, so I was left to attend to the delivery man who'd brought in a fresh supply of fruit for sale. I tried to stay out of the negotiation because that wasn't my decision to make. It was Catherine's. I was merely a hand in the store. He offered to beat the price down as a favor, but I couldn't make the decision on behalf of Catherine. And then came the old trick of appealing to my beauty. I'd seen it so many times I knew just the perfect way to react. Suddenly, the delivery man tilted his hand to the side and looked at me with some more interest. He seemed pretty sure he'd seen me before somewhere. Just as I was trying to reassure him that he had the wrong person, Catherine's baby stirred from sleep and began crying. I had to run to the back and pacify him while trying to stir the attention back to the delivery guy. I wasn't about to talk about my last with a stranger, but he persisted. The town was pretty small and he'd seen me move in a few months ago. He asked questions about the nature of my friendship with Catherine and where we'd met, each question slowly peeling away the back of a ball of onion I had no intentions of ever touching. While we were still going back and forth about whether or not he knew me, Catherine arrived, right on time and came to my rescue. The sound of her voice rang through the air as she called the delivery man to order immediately. His name was Hans. He quickly tried to play the defensive card, but Catherine was having none of it. If he'd come for business, then he'd do just that and that alone. I heaved a sigh of relief and clutched the baby tighter to my body. Unfortunately, we have to stop here for now. If you enjoyed this recap and want to catch the next part as soon as it drops, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything. And of course, drop a comment below with your thoughts or theories about what's coming next. Until then, this has been your recap of my beloved Oppressor, and we covered up to Chapter 30. See you in the next one.